Welcome back to Omni Wizard. Today's tale, what if Harry Potter absorbed the Phoenix Force and Jean, Storm and Emma Frost bowed to him? Before we dive in, do hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so not a single story ever slips past you. Alright, let's begin. Chapter 1, The Ember and the Marrow. There is a thing that lives between the stars, and it does not have a name in any tongue that uses a mouth to speak. Call it the Phoenix if you must, because that is the shape devotees have always given it when they tried to draw the undrawable. The wing-spread bird of fire that stitches death to birth and burns the seam shut behind it. But the bird is only a costume the thing wears for the comfort of small minds, the way a hurricane will consent on occasion to be photographed. What the thing actually is, dear reader, is the appetite of creation itself, the cosmic principle that the universe must be unmade in order to be made again, that nothing green grows except in the ash of something that was once also green and is now only memory and mineral. It is hunger and it is generosity, which are, if you have ever fed a child or buried a parent, two angles on the same hard geometry. It had eaten suns. It had wept galaxies into being and then, in a mood it could not always explain to itself, swallowed them. It had loved exactly one woman with the whole of its terrible attention, and the loving had gone so spectacularly, catastrophically wrong that even now, drifting in the long dark between one errand and the next, it carried the ache of it the way a burned man carries weather in his bones. And it was on the night our story properly begins, very tired and very lonely, and looking, though it would not have used so domestic a word, for somewhere to land. The thing about omniscient narration is that it lets one stand in two doorways at once, so let us be greedy and do exactly that. While the Phoenix drifted, a young man stood at the lip of a chalk cliff in Cornwall with the sea throwing itself stupidly against the rocks below, and he was thinking, with the dry and slightly weary precision that had become his native register, that he had been promised the war would be the worst of it. His name was Harry Potter. He was 23 years old. He had killed and had nearly died of being killed, and had walked into a forest at 17 with the express intention of letting a man with no nose murder him, and had come back out of that forest carrying a knowledge he had never managed to set down again. That death was not a wall but a door, and that doors by their nature open both ways. He had been a hero, which is a job no one tells you ends with paperwork. He had been, more recently, an Auror, until the politics of catching dark wizards for a ministry that had spent his childhood slandering him curdled into something he could no longer swallow with his morning tea. So he had resigned. He had bought a ridiculous cottage on a cliff with the money the wizarding world kept trying to give him out of guilt. And he had spent 8 months learning, slowly and against his own grain, how to be a person to whom nothing in particular was happening. It is a great irony of his life, and he was beginning to suspect it, that the universe had never once let him keep a quiet thing for long. The sky above the sea did something it had no business doing. It is difficult to describe, and I will not pretend otherwise. The stars did not move, exactly, but they leaned, the whole field of them tilting toward a single point above the black water like iron filings, discovering a magnet they had not known was in the room. A line of fire opened across the dark. Not a shooting star, which is only a pebble dying in the air. This was a wound in the night with light pouring out of it, gold going to white, going to a color that does not exist and that the eye reports helplessly as warmth. It came down out of the high cold with the unhurried inevitability of a verdict. Harry watched it come. He did not run, because there was nowhere on a cliff to run that the falling sky could not also reach, and because some animal stratum beneath his reason had already understood that the thing was not falling at random. It was falling at him. It had crossed a distance that made the word distance an embarrassment, and it had done so to arrive at this exact dwindling point on a small wet planet, where a particular man stood holding a mug of tea he had forgotten he was holding. He set the mug down on the grass. This struck him even in the moment as an absurd thing to have done, and he would remember it later with affection that in the last instant of being merely himself he had been worried about spilling. The fire reached him. What happened next did not happen in any order that a sentence which insists on one word following another can honestly reproduce. But omniscient narration has its privileges, and one of them is to slow the unslowable, so attend. It went in through the scar first. Of course it did. The scar on his forehead, that lightning bolt seam that had been the door for so much that was foul, turned out to be a door for this too, and the fire found it the way water finds the one crack in a dam and widens it into a country. It poured into him, and Harry's body, which had survived the killing curse twice, which had been a soul split and was now mended, which carried in its very marrow the residue of a magic older than the Romans, Harry's body did not reject it. That was the miracle or the catastrophe, and time would tell which. The cells of him that had died once and been allowed to come back recognized the thing pouring in. They had been here before. They knew the country of unmaking and the country of return, and the phoenix, brushing against that recognition, did something it had not done in a very long time. It hesitated, out of curiosity, out of perhaps hope. Most hosts, you understand, the thing simply wore. It put them on like a glove and burned through them in seasons, because flesh is not built to hold the engine that runs the tides of galaxies, and the engine does not slow itself for the comfort of the glove. But this one, this small, furious mortal with the door already cut into his skull, and the memory of death folded quietly into his every cell, this one fit in a way the thing had not felt since the red-haired woman, and the memory of the red-haired woman was a grief so enormous that the phoenix had organized whole eons around not thinking of it. So it went slowly. It threaded itself through Harry rather than detonating in him. It found the highways of his magic, the rivers of power that wizards are born with and that Harry's were broad as estuaries, and it widened them, gilded them, set them alight from within so that what had been a man's strength became something for which the word strength is a child's drawing of the sun. And all the while it spoke to him, not in words, because it had no patience for words, but in the older grammar of sensation and image, pressing against the inside of his mind a single freighted question that arrived in him as a kind of unbearable, beautiful weight. Harry, on his knees now in the wet grass with light coming out of his eyes and his open mouth, with the tea mug knocked over and steaming beside his hand, with the sea below gone abruptly, eerily flat as though it too were holding its breath, received the question and understood it not as language but as a pressure behind the sternum, and his answer, when it came, was the thing that saved his life and damned a great many other arrangements in the cosmos. He did not beg. He did not pray. He did not, as so many of the things previous hosts had done in their final hour, scream for it to stop. He thought with the cold, clear interrogative habit that had carried him through every horror of his short and overstuffed life. What are you, and what do you want, and what are the rules? The phoenix had been worshipped. It had been feared. It had been hunted across 9 galaxies by an empire that built whole theologies around its extermination. It had been loved badly and grieved enormously. But it had not, in the entire span of its incomprehensible existence, been interviewed, and the novelty of it ran through the cosmic entity like cold water down a hot stone, and the part of it that had once been a thing capable of delight discovered to its own astonishment that it was delighted. It answered him. Reader, it told him the truth, which it had never told anyone, possibly because no one had thought to simply ask. It showed him the suns. It showed him the long, patient murders that are also births, the supernovae that seed the dark with the iron in his own blood, the worlds it had drowned in light so that other worlds might exist. It showed him the red-haired woman, and the day it had loved her into a god and then watched, unable to stop, as the god had curdled and she ate a star with 1 billion living souls aboard. And it showed him the grief of that and did not flinch from showing him that the grief had a hunger inside it, that the entity wanted to do it again, that the line between the love and the unmaking was not a line at all but a smear, and that this was the true danger. Not the power but the appetite that came stapled to the power, the slow seductive logic by which a being who can do anything begins, gently, reasonably, to believe it should. And Harry Potter, kneeling in the grass with a god threaded through his marrow, looked at all of it, the glory and the genocide, the generosity and the gluttony, and did the most characteristic thing he had ever done. He did not look away, and he did not surrender, and he did not pretend the dark parts were not there. He said in the wordless place where they were speaking more or less this, then we'll need rules. Because I've already let a thing live in my head once that wanted to use my hands, and I will burn. He chose the word on purpose, and felt the entity register the joke and impossibly enjoy it. I will burn the whole of you out of me before I let it happen twice. So, we negotiate or we don't do this at all. It is a curious fact about overwhelming power that it respects more than anything the one creature in the room who is not impressed by it. The fire banked. The light withdrew from Harry's eyes, drawing back down into him the way a tide draws back down a beach, leaving him gasping on his hands and knees in grass that had been scorched in a perfect ring around him and was already absurdly growing back, new green threading up through the black in fast motion, flowers he could not name opening where his fingers gripped the earth. The sea below remembered how to move and crashed back into its rhythm with a sound like applause. The stars unleaned. And Harry knelt in the center of a small impossible spring, with a cosmic engine purring in the cellar of his soul, and discovered that he could feel the lighthouse keeper asleep 2 miles down the coast, and the gulls dreaming their stupid violent gull dreams in the cliff face, and the slow tectonic grind of the continent itself, and much farther a thread of warmth across an ocean and a sea, a single human mind that had gone suddenly, electrically awake. That was reaching toward him across the curve of the world with a recognition that mirrored his own, that was thinking a name he could feel but not yet read. He got to his feet. He was shaking, which he noted with clinical interest, the way one notes a reading on an instrument. He picked up the fallen mug. It had not broken. The tea was gone into the grass, feeding, he supposed, the flowers. "All right," he said aloud to the empty cliff and the busy sea and the thing inside him that was the size of everything. His voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. "Rule 1, you don't drive." The entity in the cellar of him did something that he would spend a long time learning to interpret and that he settled provisionally on calling a smile. We will leave him there a moment, for there are other doorways to stand in, and the considerate narrator distributes his attention, but mark the image, because it is the whole of him in miniature. A man who has just been handed the power to remake the cosmos, standing on a cliff in the rain, worried about a mug, laying down the law to a god. Far away in a green and stately valley in the north of New York State, a woman sat up in bed with her hands pressed flat against her sternum and the taste of fire in her mouth. Jean Grey had hosted the Phoenix. Let us be precise about a debt that the rest of this story will spend itself repaying. She had not borrowed it, had not glimpsed it, had not, as the gossips of the mutant community like to imply, merely been touched by it the way one is touched by good luck or a passing celebrity. She had been it and it had been her, and the seam between those two facts had been, for a long and luminous and terrible while, invisible even to her. She had loved with its love and grieved with its grief, and in a chapter of her life she had clawed her way back from at a cost she did not discuss. She had nearly unmade with its unmaking. She had died. She had come back because that is the entity's signature and it had signed her. And she had spent every day since learning the difficult art of being a powerful woman who was nonetheless only herself, only Jean, with her own two ordinary, extraordinary hands, in a body that had once been a doorway for infinity and now had to be content being a home. She knew the taste of fire in her mouth the way a widow knows a particular cologne on a stranger in a crowd. "It's back," she said to the dark of her room, and then, because the dark did not answer and because the knowing was too large to hold alone, she reached out with the gift that was hers and not the Phoenix's, the clean human telepathy she had been born to, and she touched the mind of the man who slept in the great house below, the man who had taught her to be more than her fear. She found him already awake. Of course she did. Charles Xavier's thoughts came to her with the particular texture they always had, like a hand laid calmly over a frightened animal, except that tonight the hand itself was not entirely steady. "I felt it," he told her, mind to mind, in the wordless intimacy that was the truest language either of them owned. Across the world. A flare in the psionic field unlike anything since, and here he did her the courtesy of not finishing the sentence, of not saying "since you," but they both heard it anyway, the way you hear the bell after the clapper has stopped. "It chose someone," Jean answered. Her own thoughts, as she shaped them, carried an undertone she could not suppress, and that Charles, gentleman that he was, pretended not to notice, not only fear. Something older and more dangerous than fear, the thing that the entity always woke in those it had once worn, a yearning so total it had no bottom, the homesickness of a soul for the fire it had been cast out of. She breathed through it. She had years of practice breathing through it. It chose someone and it didn't burn them. "Charles, I felt the moment. It went slow. It's never gone slow, not once, not even with me." A long pause in which she could feel him thinking, the great machine of that mind turning over the implications with the unhurried gravity of a glacier. "Then we have a great deal to learn," Charles said, very gently, "and a very little time, I suspect, in which to learn it. The Shi'ar will have felt this too. Across the gulf of space, in the throne world of the Bird Empire that had once condemned her to die for crimes the entity committed through her, an alarm was, even now, very likely beginning to sound. He did not say so. He did not have to. Jean had stood trial in front of a galaxy. She remembered the shape of their justice. "Get dressed, Jean, wake Auror." And his presence in her mind softened, became the thing that had first made her trust him, all those years ago, the kindness that did not condescend. "Be careful with yourself. You have not stood this close to that fire since it nearly took you. No one would think less of you for keeping your distance." "I would," Jean told him, and withdrew, and got out of bed, and stood for a moment in the dark with her hand still pressed to her sternum, feeling across the entire turning width of the world that distant ember she had once carried, now carried by someone else. And feeling, she made herself name it, because she had learned that the unnamed thing is the thing that drives, feeling jealous and ashamed of the jealousy, and underneath both, like a coal under ash, something that was almost terribly like hope. The reader will please remember, when matters between Jean Grey and Harry Potter become complicated, that they began here. Two people who had each held the same impossible fire, reaching for one another across the dark, before either of them knew the other's face. Morning in Cornwall arrived as it always does without consulting anyone, and found Harry Potter sitting at his kitchen table conducting what he privately thought of as the world's strangest physical examination. He had not slept. He had not wanted to. He suspected correctly. that the boundary between his dreams and the entity's memories would be thinned to the point of porousness, and he was not yet ready to walk through the red-haired woman's death every time he closed his eyes. So he had spent the night doing what Harry Potter did when handed an incomprehensible problem and no instructions. He had experimented. He had started small because he was not a fool, whatever certain potions masters had once written on his school reports. He had pointed a finger at the cold kettle and thought, gently warm, and the kettle had not warmed. It had begun instantly and alarmingly to glow the color of a forge, the metal sagging, the water inside flashing to steam with a shriek, and he had pulled the impulse back so hard that frost had bloomed across the windows and his own breath had fogged. He had sat very still after that. He had understood in his marrow the lesson the kettle was teaching, that the entity did not have a low setting, that its native unit of measurement was the star, and that everything he had ever known about the careful, calibrated, wand-mediated discipline of magic now had to be relearned from the foundation up, because the wand had been a tap and this was the sea. He had tried the opposite direction next, the gentler one, because a man should know the shape of a tool's mercy as well as its edge. There had been a gull on the windowsill at 3 in the morning with a wing that hung wrong, a wing that had met a fence or a cat or simply the indifferent arithmetic of weather, and Harry had looked at it and thought, without spell or wand, mend, and the wing had mended, but it had not stopped at mending. The bird had gone on knitting itself past whole into something brighter and stranger, the feathers along its back kindling to a low gold, the small black eyes filling with a light that did not belong in a gull, and Harry had pulled the impulse back appalled, and the creature had shaken itself and flown off into the dark entirely ordinary again, and entirely alive, and he had sat with the understanding that the entity could not heal without also, given half a chance, transfiguring. That its mercy and its ambition were the same gesture made at different volumes, and that the difference between saving a thing and remaking it into something it never asked to be was, in the hands of a god, a matter of one held breath. He had thought of Madame Pomfrey, who had mended his bones a dozen times and never once been tempted to improve them. He had wanted very badly to be that careful. He was not yet sure he could be, so he had built rules. He was good at rules. He had spent his life either breaking other people's or, increasingly, designing better ones. By dawn, he had a working list scratched on the back of an electricity bill in handwriting that got steadier as the night wore on, and he read it over now with his tea, fresh tea. He had made it the ordinary way with the ordinary kettle which had survived, and he found the ordinariness enormously consoling. Rule 1, it doesn't drive. He had reaffirmed this several times in the night, the way one tests a lock. The entity had not contested it. He was not naive enough to think this meant the question was settled forever. Rule 2, intent is the throttle, attention is the brakes. The kettle had taught him that the power did not respond to the words of magic he knew, but to the wanting underneath them, and that a flicker of want unwatched became a flood, so he would watch. He had a great deal of practice watching himself. It was, he reflected with the editorializing irony that was so much a part of him, possibly the only useful thing the Dursleys had ever taught him. Rule 3, and here his handwriting had pressed so hard it tore the paper. When it tells you that you deserve this, that you have earned the right to fix things, that the world would be better if you simply made it so. That is the appetite talking, and the appetite is how it eats its hosts, and you will treat that voice as you treated the locket. You will recognize it. You will not argue with it. You will simply refuse. He had not added a rule 4 because he did not yet know what the great fourth thing was that he was missing, only that he was missing it. He suspected it had something to do with the thread of warmth across the ocean, the awake mind that had reached for him in the dark and was, he could feel even now over breakfast, getting closer. Traveling, coming to him, he found he was not afraid of it. He was, against every instinct a lifetime of ambushes had drilled into him, glad. He was contemplating this gladness with some suspicion when the entity, which had been quiet all morning in the manner of a large cat pretending to be furniture, stirred and pressed against the inside of his attention an image, not a memory this time but a perception, the cosmic equivalent of a tap on the shoulder. Across the moor, beyond the warded edge of his property, 3 figures had appeared out of nothing with the particular spatial rudeness of apparition, and they were robed, and they were masked, and the one in front had a hunger in him that Harry's new senses read as clearly as a printed page. Death Eaters. Reader, you did not think they had all been tidied away, did you? Movements do not die when their leaders do, they go quiet, and they wait, and they tell each other stories about the Master's return until one day a flare of impossible power lights up the magical firmament of an entire island, and every dark and patient thing that has been waiting feels it at once and thinks, there. The power he promised us, the power that will bring him back. Harry set down his tea for the second time in 12 hours. He was getting tired, he thought, of being interrupted at breakfast. He went out to meet them through the front garden where the flowers that had grown overnight in the scorching were turning their faces toward him as he passed, which he was choosing for the sake of his sanity not to examine too closely. The morning was gray and clean. The three figures stood at the property line, and the wards, good wards Auror grade he had set them himself, were sparking and failing against something the lead figure held cupped in his hands, a smoking black artifact that Harry recognized with a sinking familiarity as a soul fragment vessel, the kind of thing the Death Eaters had spent the quiet years cobbling together out of the leavings of their master's ruin. Potter. The lead Death Eater's voice came muffled through the silver mask, and under it ran a vibration of something that was almost religious. We felt you. All of England felt you. You've found it, haven't you? The power that was promised, the Dark Lord's true inheritance. You've come a long way for a misunderstanding, Harry said. He stood easily, hands loose at his sides, no wand in them, and some calmer animal in the three men seemed to register the wrongness of that, the way prey registers the stillness of a thing too confident to bother crouching. Whatever it is you think I found, it isn't his, and it isn't yours, and it very much isn't going to spend its first morning on this earth helping resurrect a man I already killed twice. So you can leave and I'll let you, and that's not nothing, that's an offer I wouldn't have made you a year ago. Or, the vessel in the man's hands smoked harder. Behind him, his two companions had begun to raise their wands. Harry looked at them. And here, dear reader, is where we must be careful, because what happened in the next 4 seconds would be misremembered and mythologized across the wizarding world within the week, told and retold until it became something it was not, and the truth of it was both smaller and far larger than the legend. He did not raise a hand. He did not speak a spell. He simply, and this is the only honest way to say it, he simply decided that the curse already leaving the leftmost wand should not exist, and it did not. The green light of it, that particular green that Harry had reason to hate more than any color in creation, did not so much stop as unhappen, withdrawing back up the wand and into the not yet. The magic of it disassembled into its constituent intention, and the intention found, suddenly, that it had nowhere to be. The Death Eater who had cast it made a sound that no fully composed person makes. That, said Harry conversationally, and the morning light around him had taken on a faint, impossible warmth, gold gathering at the edges of him as heat shimmer gathers over a road, is what I can do without trying. I'd genuinely rather not show you what trying looks like. I haven't worked it out myself yet, and I have a strong feeling that when I do, this whole cliff stops being here. The soul vessel in the lead man's hands cracked, all on its own with a sound like a tooth breaking, and the foul smoke in it guttered and died. And the man stared down at it in dawning horror, because he understood now what Harry had understood the moment they appeared, that the thing inside Harry had been very gently the whole time they spoke, eating the dark magic in the artifact the way a flame eats the air in a sealed room quietly without fuss, until there was none left and the room was simply, finally clean. Tell whoever sent you, Harry said, and his voice was kind, which was somehow the most frightening thing about it, that the power they're looking for found a different door. Tell them it found mine. And tell them, he paused and considered, and the entity in the cellar of him pressed forward with an offering, an image of the bird empire of an old hunt, of how these things always ended, and Harry gently declined it because he had a rule about that. Tell them I'm asking nicely exactly once. They left. Of course they left. They were dark wizards, not martyrs, and the difference between the two is precisely the willingness to die, which these three discovered, in the clarifying presence of a god in a man's body on a grey Cornish morning, that they did not possess after all. They disapparated with the particular haste of men who will tell the story very differently to their superiors, and the moor was empty again, and the flowers in Harry's garden turned altogether back toward him. Harry stood alone in the cleared morning and let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like a year. His hands were shaking again. He looked at them with the same clinical interest as before and found this time that the shaking was not fear. It was the appetite the entity had wanted to chase. It had wanted very reasonably, very warmly, to follow the three fleeing men back to whatever hole they'd crawled from into the dark, patient thing that was trying to be reborn, and to unmake all of it root and branch with a thoroughness that would leave the world cleaner in Harry's conscience. The entity gently suggested, entirely at ease. It had been such a reasonable suggestion, that was the horror of it. It had felt like his own idea, wearing his own voice, arguing for the things he already wanted. He recognized it. He did not argue with it, he refused. Rule 3, he said aloud shakily to the garden and the sea and the thing inside him. We talked about this. And the entity, after a moment, banked, but more slowly this time than on the cliff, with more reluctance. And Harry understood that this was going to be the true war, not the dark wizards and not the bird empire. He could feel like a storm front at the edge of his new perceptions. But this, the daily quiet refusal, the thousand small no's by which a man either keeps his soul or courteously, reasonably, with the best of intentions, loses it. He went back inside to make a third pot of tea, and that more than the unhappened curse, more than the cleaned artifact, is the measure of him. That the cosmos had set its appetite loose in him, and he answered it with the ritual of the kettle, the human liturgy of waiting for water to boil. She arrived at sunset, which the narrator notes was either a remarkable coincidence or the entity's idea of stagecraft, and declines to say which. Harry felt her cross the wards, what was left of them, long before he saw her. The thread of warmth he had been tracking all day finally resolving into a single human shape walking up the cliff path with the low gold light behind her. And he went out to meet her with no wand and no plan, and a curiosity that had been building in him since the dark of the night before. The entity stirred as she approached, but it did not press forward with appetite. It pressed forward with something else, something that staggered Harry with its intensity before he understood what he was feeling: recognition, longing, a grief so old and so vast that it had become a kind of geology. The entity knew her. The entity had worn her, and it wanted with the whole of its incomprehensible heart to go home to her, and could not because it lived in Harry now, and the impossibility of that, the lover and the new house standing 20 feet apart in the dying light, was the most painful thing Harry had felt since the war. He set it aside. Rule 1, the entity did not drive, and that included this. You're the one who reached for me, he said, last night, across the ocean. And you're the one who reached back. Jean Grey stopped at the edge of his garden where the impossible flowers grew, and she looked at them and then at him, and her face did a complicated thing that he could not read and that she did not try to hide. Do you know what's inside you? Some of it, it showed me, the sons, that he hesitated, because there are courtesies even between strangers, and especially between these two, the woman with the red hair. Jean Grey was very still. The wind off the sea moved her hair, which was also red, and Harry felt the entity in him surge toward her with such force that he had to plant his feet. And he understood all at once in a rush of comprehension that was half his and half the things, exactly who she was and what she had been and why the grief in him had a geology. It wasn't me, she said quietly, not the woman it loved. That was a long time ago, and another host, and I came after and I carried it, and she stopped. She had not come here to confess. She had come, she reminded herself, to assess a threat, to determine whether the world had a new dark phoenix gestating on a Cornish cliff, whether she would have to do to this stranger what the galaxy had once tried to do to her. She had come braced for a monster or a victim. She had not come braced for a man making tea who looked at her with the entity's longing in his eyes, and beneath it plainly visible his own startled human kindness, refusing to let the longing move his hands. It's not driving you, she said, and it was not a question, and her voice when she said it was not entirely steady. How is it not driving you? It always drives. It drove me into the heart of a star. Rule 1, Harry said. She looked at him. I made rules, he said a little defensively, as though she had laughed, though she had not. Last night, I wrote them on the back of an electricity bill. It seemed sensible. It's the most powerful thing in the universe, and it lives in my skull, so I sat down and I worked out the terms. Rule 1 is it doesn't drive. Rule 3 is that when it tells me I've earned the right to fix the world, I treat that the way I treated a Horcrux that spent a year whispering in my ear. Because I have, in fact, done this before, the part where a powerful evil thing tries to use my hands, and I got good at saying number. He stopped. He realized he had said a great deal. There's a rule 2 as well. It's about throttles. It's less interesting. Jean Grey stood at the edge of the garden in the gold light with the sea behind her, and she had crossed an ocean braced for the worst thing she could imagine. The fire she had nearly become let loose in someone with no idea what it was. And instead she had found a man who had met the most dangerous force in creation, and responded by writing it a set of house rules on the back of a utility bill. And the thing that broke open in her then was so unexpected and so enormous that she did the one thing she had absolutely not planned to do, which was laugh. A real laugh startled out of her, the first in longer than she wanted to count. Rules, she said. You made it rules. It's working so far. It nearly took the world from me. It nearly took me from me. And you, she shook her head and the laugh was gone, but something it had cleared a space for remained. You negotiated. It seemed rude not to, Harry said, given it was moving in, and Jean Grey laughed again, and the entity in the cellar of Harry's soul went very quiet and very still and turned the whole of its terrible attention on the sound of it, on this woman it had loved and worn and grieved, laughing in the garden of its new home, and for one suspended moment the longing in Harry was so total and so tender that he could not tell whose it was. That, dear reader, is the trouble with housing a god who has loved before. You inherit the loving along with the fire. Harry Potter, who had spent his life being handed other people's burdens, had just been handed the oldest and largest one in the cosmos, and the cruelty and the gift of it was that he could not yet tell, and would not be able to tell for some time, where the entity's ancient devotion ended, and his own ordinary human regard for a remarkable woman in the sunset began. Stay, he said, and meant it as an invitation, and heard it come out as something closer to a need, and was embarrassed, and did not take it back. You crossed an ocean. at least have some tea. And you can, I don't know, tell me what I'm missing. There's a fourth rule I haven't worked out. I think you might be it. Jean Grey looked at the cottage and the impossible garden and at Harry and the fire she could feel banked behind his eyes, held there not by chains but by choice, by a discipline she had never managed and had nearly died for lacking. She thought of Charles's voice in her mind. No one would think less of you for keeping your distance. She thought of her own answer. I would. All right, she said. Tea. She glanced once more at the garden, at the flowers that had turned to follow her like a congregation tracking a procession, and her mouth tilted. You should know those will keep doing that. The growing, the reaching. It leaks out of you whether you mean it to or not, into the ground, into the weather, into people if you're not careful. I spent 2 years learning that a host doesn't get to clock off. Everything you love starts becoming a little more itself just by standing near you, and everything you fear does too, and the only work that matters is learning which one you're feeding. That sounds, Harry said, like a rule 4. It sounds like the rest of your life. She did not say it unkindly. She said it the way one veteran tells another what the wound will do in cold weather, and Harry heard the years inside it, the cost of every word, and understood that she had not crossed an ocean to assess a threat after all, or not only that. She had crossed it because somewhere in the dark she had felt the fire go gentle for the first time in the history of the fire, and she had needed with everything in her to know whether gentleness was possible, whether the thing that had nearly ended her could, in better hands than hers had been, become something other than a tragedy waiting for its third act. Show me the kitchen, Harry Potter, and the electricity bill. I'd like to read these rules of yours. And she stepped across the property line, into the garden where the flowers turned to follow her, and the entity sighed through the whole length of Harry Potter like wind through a canyon, and somewhere across the unthinkable gulf of space, a bird empire's instruments confirmed the impossible reading a second time, and a cold voice gave an order that would in time bring fire to this small green world, but that is a later chapter and the considerate narrator does not spoil the tea. They went inside. Harry put the kettle on, the ordinary one, and it boiled in the ordinary time, and 2 people who had each carried infinity sat at a small table in a cottage on a cliff and began, with the awkwardness of strangers and the strange intimacy of the long bereaved, to talk. Outside, the sun went down into the sea. Inside, the most dangerous thing in the universe sat banked and listening in the mirror of a man who had told it no, and for the length of one evening at least, the no held, and that, the holding, the choosing, the warm light in the cottage window with the enormous dark all around it, that is where we leave them, and that is, in the end, the entire wager of this story. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2 The Pupil and the Furnace. Jean Grey stayed 3 days, and in those 3 days she taught Harry Potter more about the thing inside him than the thing had managed to teach him itself, which tells you something about the difference between knowing a fire from the inside and having survived it from the outside. She had meant to stay an afternoon. We may as well be honest about that, since the narrator can see into the small dishonest negotiations people conduct with themselves at thresholds. She had meant to drink 1 cup of tea, read the absurd electricity bill, satisfy herself that the new host was neither monster nor imminent corpse, and then telephone Charles from the village and tell him that the situation was stable, or at least that it had not yet begun to be unstable, which in matters Phoenix-related is the most one is usually permitted to hope. She had meant to keep her professional distance, her veteran's wariness, the calluses she had grown over the place where the fire had once lived in her, and instead she had sat at a small kitchen table while a man explained to her, with the grave seriousness of an engineer presenting a load-bearing diagram, why he had concluded that the entity's power scaled not linearly with desire but exponentially with certainty, and she had found herself leaning forward and arguing, and at some point in the second hour she had taken the pencil out of his hand to correct a premise, and it had been, she realized, somewhere around midnight. The most interesting conversation she had had in a decade. It's not the wanting, Harry said that first evening, gesturing with a slightly singed teaspoon. He had a habit, she was learning, of gesturing with whatever he was holding, because physical objects helped him think. Everyone always says it's the wanting. The dark wizards this morning thought it was the wanting. They kept talking about hunger, about the master's appetite, convinced the trick was to want hard enough. But that's backwards. I wanted the kettle warm and it nearly melted the kettle. Wanting's just the ignition. The thing that determines how big the fire gets is how sure I am that I'm right to light it. Jean was very quiet. He did not know, could not have known, on his first day of housing the thing, how precisely he had described the architecture of her own catastrophe. She had not wanted to eat the star, not in the way the word wanting suggests, the hot grasping greed of it. She had simply, for one luminous and unrepentant moment, been certain that she had the right. Say that again, she said. Which part? The certainty part. She had set down her own cup. Say it again slowly and watch what the fire does while you say it. he did. And he was a clever enough man and had spent enough of his life under attack to have a fine instinct for the moment a conversation turns surgical, to understand that she was not asking idly, that she was using him as an instrument to read a measurement she had spent years unable to take on herself. He said it slowly. He felt the entity in the cellar of him incline toward the word right the way a plant inclines toward light, felt the power gather and thicken and grow eager, and he understood, watching it, what she had given him, not a fact but a warning system. The fire did not flare when he was angry. It did not flare when he was frightened or grieved or even when he merely wanted. It flared when he was certain, because certainty is the precise psychological state in which a person stops checking whether they should, and the entity, which was all should and no whether, loved nothing in a host so much as the silencing of the question. "Oh," Harry said softly. "Oh, that's the whole thing, isn't it? Rule 4, the moment I stop doubting is the moment it has me." "That's Rule 4, Jean agreed, and something in her chest, some long clenched thing, eased by a degree she did not advertise. Because she had spent a great deal of the last decade being quietly, privately afraid that the corruption had been a flaw in her specifically, a weakness in Jean Grey, a softness the fire had found and pried open, and here was a man arriving at the truth from the outside in an evening, mapping it like a coastline. That it was not weakness the fire exploited but conviction, that the surest, most righteous, most certain version of a person was the one the phoenix could most easily wear, and that therefore the safest host in all the cosmos would be precisely the kind of person who could stand at the center of infinite power and still, reliably, ask himself whether he might be wrong. She looked at Harry Potter across his small kitchen table with his terrible glasses and his ridiculous garden and his electricity bill commandments, and she revised, privately and with some alarm, every estimate she had arrived with. We must, in fairness, look in on the opposition, who were not idle. In a damp manor in the Midlands that had once been grand and was now merely large, in a cold room where the windows had been bricked over against the light, the thing that had been Lord Voldemort was reassembling itself, and it was furious, and it was, though it would have used the Cruciatus curse on anyone who said so, afraid. He had not died. This is the inconvenient arithmetic of Dark Lords. They spend their youth ensuring they cannot die, and then spend their long, unwanted afterlives discovering exactly how thin a margin cannot die turns out to be. Harry had destroyed the Horcruxes, all of them. The snake and the diadem and the cup and the rest of that foul collection, and the body in the great hall had been the end of something. But a soul is butchered and scattered as Voldemort's does not so much die as disperse, and a faithful enough remnant of followers, scraping together the dregs of forbidden ritual across patient years, could coax the dispersal back toward coherence. He was not yet a man. He was a pressure in a cold room, a malevolence wearing a half-formed homunculus of a body grown in a vat the Lestranges had bought from a Romanian who asked no questions. He was weak. He hated being weak more than he hated Harry Potter, which was saying a very great deal. And then 3 nights passed, while his stolen heart beat its sluggish first rhythms, he had felt the world catch fire. Every magical creature on the island had felt it, but Voldemort had felt it the way a starving thing feels a banquet 2 rooms away, as need made physical. Power. Power of a scale that made his Horcruxes look like a child's hoarding of buttons. Power that did not bleed and could not be bargained with, power that had landed, his trembling spies confirmed, on a cliff in Cornwall, in the skull of the one person in the universe Voldemort would least have chosen to give it to. The injustice of it, the sheer cosmic insult. He had clawed his way back from oblivion across years, fighting for every scrap of himself, and the universe had simply handed godhood to the orphan as a door prize. "He sent them back to me," Voldemort said to the kneeling, shaking Death Eater who had brought the report, one of the 3 from the cliff, the only one composed enough to deliver his own humiliation in person. "He destroyed the vessel, he unmade Avery's curse in the casting, and he sent you back to me as a messenger." The half-formed mouth worked around the words. "What was the message?" "He, my lord," he said. The man could not look up. He said he was asking nicely exactly once. There was a silence in the brick-top room that went on a long time. "Nicely," Voldemort repeated. And then he did something his followers had never heard him do and would never speak of afterward to anyone, because to speak of it was to die. He laughed, a dreadful wet sound from a throat that was not finished being a throat, because the absurdity of it had pierced even his immense and humorless self-regard. The orphan with the power of a god had asked him nicely. "He doesn't know what he has," Voldemort said when the laughter had curdled back into calculation. "That's the gift in this, Avery. He doesn't know. My spies say he's making rules like a prefect. A man who must make rules for his power is a man who fears his power, and a man who fears his power can be made to use it badly in haste and terror, and power used in terror is power that can be stolen. The not yet eyes glittered in the dark. We will not attack him, we will frighten him, we will make the godling burn something he loves, and we will be there in the ash to gather what falls. It was, the narrator must concede, not a stupid plan. Voldemort was many vile things, but he had never been stupid, and he had identified with the unerring instinct of a predator for the soft place, the exact center of the danger Harry posed to himself. Mark it. It will matter. The Dark Lord and the Bird Empire and the woman with the red hair had all, by entirely different roads, arrived at the same single truth about Harry Potter, that the only thing in the cosmos capable of destroying him was the thing he was most afraid of becoming. Some hundreds of miles away, in a private suite above a Boston skyline that she owned a regrettable amount of, Emma Frost was reading a man's mind for sport and finding it, as usual, a disappointment. The man across the restaurant table, a financier expensively tailored who believed himself to be conducting a seduction, had a mind like a show home. Every surface staged, nothing real left out, and behind the staging a cramped little engine of appetite and insecurity running exactly the program she had read in 10,000 Men before him. She knew what he would say before he said it. She knew the lie about the divorce and the truth about the second mortgage and the precise wattage of the regard he expected in exchange for the wine. She had stopped somewhere in her fourth decade of being the sharpest telepath in any room she condescended to enter, finding people surprising, and a woman who is never surprised is a woman in some danger of deciding that nothing is worth the trouble of wanting. And then the world had caught fire 3 nights ago, and even Emma Frost, armored behind her discipline, her diamond, her contempt, had felt it crawl up the back of her skull like a hand she had not invited. And she had set down her glass mid-sentence and looked at nothing, and the financier had asked if she was quite all right, and she had not answered him because she was busy. Because in the great gray wash of the planet's psychic noise, the static of 8 billion small frightened minds that she had long ago learned to tune out the way one tunes out traffic, something had lit up that was not noise. Something with a shape. A column of power standing on the edge of an ocean, and around it, this was the part that had made her abandon a perfectly serviceable evening and a man who owned a shipping concern. Around it, quiet, a locked door. A mind she could feel the heat of and could not, when she pressed against it with the casual confidence of a woman who had walked uninvited through the defenses of kings, get into, not slip past, not crack, not even find the seam of. The mind was simply, serenely, absolutely closed to her, and on its closed surface her probe had slid off the way a hand slides off a sphere of glass, and somewhere on a cliff 1,000 miles away she had the distinct and infuriating impression that whatever lived behind that door had felt her knock and chosen, with what she could only describe as amusement, not to answer. Emma Frost had been a great many things in her life. A queen, a villain, a teacher, a survivor of fires both literal and otherwise, and she had organized the whole of her formidable self around a single unspoken proposition. That there was no mind she could not eventually open, and therefore no person who could ultimately hold power over her, because to read a man entire is to own him. The locked door on the cliff was an affront to her cosmology. It was also, and she was honest enough with herself in the privacy of her own diamond skull to admit it, the most interesting thing that had happened to her in years. When Charles's summons reached her the next morning, phrased in his maddening way as a request, when they both knew perfectly well she had already packed, she read between the lines of it before she finished the first sentence. A new host. The Phoenix returned, and not in poor doomed Jean this time. And Charles, who knew her too well, who had been picking the lock of her better nature for 20 years with a patience she resented and relied upon in equal measure, had appended a single line that he knew, the manipulative old saint, would seal it. He has built defenses none of us can pass. Auror and Jean will help him stand. You, Emma, are the only one of us who can tell us what he is when he does not wish to be seen. If that is, you can get past a wall that has already turned you away once. Oh, you appalling man, Emma said aloud to the empty suite with something that was almost affection and almost hunger and entirely awake. She had not felt awake in a long time. She rather resented him for that, too. She telephoned for the jet, and she dressed for the occasion, white of course, always white, because a woman who walks into a furnace ought to do it in a color that shows the soot, and she went to find out what manner of man could close a door in the face of Emma Frost and make her want, more than she had wanted anything in years, to be let in. On the second day, Jean made Harry fly. Not on a broom. She had laughed at the broom, an actual laugh when he offered it, and he had been obscurely wounded, and then, watching her laugh, not wounded at all. She made him fly as she could fly, as the fire flew, by the simple expedient of deciding that the rule which kept him on the ground was a rule he was permitted to suspend. "You're overthinking it," she called. She was 30 feet up in the gray Cornish air over the cliff, hanging in nothing as casually as a woman leaning on a fence, her hair moving in a wind that did not seem to be touching anything else. "You keep trying to push against the ground. You don't push. The phoenix doesn't push. It just stops agreeing that the ground has a claim on you." "That," Harry called back from the ground, where he was standing with his arms folded and his hair full of sea wind and a deep constitutional suspicion of being made to look foolish, "is the most mystical nonsense I've ever heard, and I attended a school that taught divination." And yet, she drifted lower until she was level with his eyes, floating a foot off the grass, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold that came and went in her irises, the residue of the fire she had carried. "You walked into a forest to die once. You told me that last night when you were explaining the death resonance thing. You decided the ground had no claim on you, that you'd give yourself up, and you walked. So you already know how to do this. You've done the hard version. This is just the same decision about gravity instead of mortality." And the maddening thing, the thing that made Harry Potter glare at her with an exasperation that had a great deal of warmth folded into it, was that she was right. He thought about the forest. He thought about the long walk under the trees with the snitch warm in his palm and his dead family walking beside him like breath made visible, and the particular interior motion of laying down the claim the world had on him, the letting go that was not despair but its strange courageous opposite. He did that motion again now on the cliff, with the difference that this time he intended to stay alive at the end of it. He rose off the ground. It was not graceful. He would like the record to show, and the narrator is happy to oblige, that it was not graceful that he came off the grass at an angle listing, his arms windmilling in a way that entirely undercut the cosmic dignity of the moment, and that Jean Grey laughed at him again openly, delightedly, and that he found, hanging crooked and undignified in the air 30 feet over the sea with a god in his marrow and a remarkable woman laughing at him, that he was happier than he had been in years. The entity in the cellar of him was quiet. It was not always quiet near her. But in these moments, the flying, the laughing, the human comedy of it, it went still and attentive, as though it too were learning something it had forgotten it could feel. Harry had stopped trying by the second day to separate his own gladness from the entity's ancient devotion, because he had concluded that the separation might not be possible, and that pretending it would be its own kind of lie. He was honest where he could afford to be. It was one of the few luxuries his life had reliably permitted him. They flew out over the water. She showed him how to feel the weather, the great slow engines of pressure and temperature that made the wind, and he found he could touch them, could feel the storm gathering 40 miles out to sea like a fist closing, and could, he tested it carefully with one hand and ruled too firmly in mind, could ask it gently to open. The clouds thinned. A shaft of sun came down on the gray water like a spotlight finding a stage. "Stop," Jean said, and her voice had changed, and he stopped. "What?" "You just turned a storm." She was watching him, and the laughter was gone, and in its place was the veteran's wariness he had glimpsed in her on the first evening and not seen since. 40 miles of weather, you nudged it open like a curtain. Harry, that's not nothing. That's a thing whole pantheons used to demand sacrifice for, and you did it to show me a patch of sun, and you didn't even." She stopped. "Did it feel like effort?" He considered. "No," he admitted. "Did it feel like enough?" And there it was. He understood the question because he had felt the answer rise in him before she finished asking it, the warm, reasonable voice that was the most dangerous voice in the universe. That the patch of sun was nice, but a man who could turn a storm could turn all the storms, could give the whole gray island a summer it had never had, could end the droughts in the places that starved for rain and stop the floods in the places that drowned, could fix the weather of an entire world before lunch. And what kind of coward, what kind of frightened prefect of a man would turn one storm to show a woman a patch of sun and then stop? "No," Harry said aloud to the voice, as he had learned to. "It didn't. And that's exactly why I'm going to stop now." He let the weather go, the clouds closed, the shaft of sun winked out, and the gray came back ordinary and cold and real, and he hung in the air over the water and breathed. "It's so reasonable," he said, not to Jean or not only to her. "That's what no one warns you about. It never asks you to do anything cruel. It asks you to do something kind, and then a slightly bigger kindness, and then it points out, very gently, that the only thing stopping you from being kind to everyone is your own arbitrary insistence on stopping." Jean Grey, hanging in the air beside him, closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them they were wet, and she did not pretend otherwise, and she did not look away. "No one warned me either," she said. "I want you to know that, when it happened to me, there was no one who'd held it and lived to teach the rest. I had to learn all of this by," her voice did something and steadied, "by losing. You're learning it by asking. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Do you understand what you might be able to do that I never could because you keep stopping?" "Show me," Harry said. "Whatever it is you think I might be able to do, stay and show me. I'll keep stopping. You keep telling me when." It was not a romantic speech. The narrator has read romantic speeches, and this was not one. It was two damaged, competent people negotiating a working arrangement over the sea. And yet Jean Grey heard underneath it the thing that romantic speeches usually only gesture at and rarely contain, which is the offer of partnership between equals in a thing that no one else alive could share. And she found that her professional distance, her veteran's calluses, the careful clinical reasons she had given Charles for coming, had all quietly dissolved somewhere over the gray water. And what remained was a woman who did not want to fly back across the ocean and leave the only other person in the universe who knew what the inside of the fire felt like. "I'll stay," she said. "For a while, I have to call Charles. He's going to want you to come to the school. There are people there who can help, and people there who will be terrified of you and who'll want to manage both. And there are," she hesitated, because she was about to introduce a complication she did not yet fully understand herself. "There are others he'll send, soon, whether you invite them or not. You lit up the psionic field of the entire planet, Harry. You were never going to be a secret." "Others," Harry said. "Auror," Jean said. "Storm. You'll like her or you'll be terrified of her, or both. Most people manage both. She commands whether the way you nudged that storm, except she's spent her whole life learning the discipline you're learning in a week, and she'll have opinions about you turning the sky on for a girl." A flicker of something that was not quite jealousy and not quite humor crossed her face and was gone. And Emma is," Jean was quiet for a moment, over the water, choosing her words the way one chooses footing on ice. "Emma Frost," she said, "is the most dangerous telepath alive who isn't Charles, and possibly including Charles, and she will walk into your house and try to read every secret you have within the first 30 seconds, because that's how she says hello. She used to be an enemy. She's something more complicated now. She is brilliant, and she is cold, and she dresses like a provocation, and she has never in her life met a powerful man she didn't want to either own or dismantle, usually to find out which he deserves." Jean looked at him. "And you're going to be the first man she's ever met whose mind she can't get into, because the fire will lock her out. And Harry, I have known Emma Frost for years, and I am telling you as a friend, as the only thing approaching a warning I can give you, she will find that absolutely irresistible." Harry absorbed this. The sea moved below them. The entity in his marrow, which had been quiet, stirred with what he was learning to recognize as interest, not appetite this time, but the old, vast, patient curiosity of a thing that had watched a billion years of beings circling one another and found the dance after all this time still worth watching. "You're describing," Harry said slowly, "a woman who's going to arrive at my home specifically to get inside my head, fail, and decide that the failure is the most attractive thing that's ever happened to her. Yes, and the regal weather goddess who will disapprove of me on sight. Probably, and you." Jean Grey looked at him, hanging in the air over the gray Cornish sea with the wind in her red hair and the fire banked behind her eyes, and she did not pretend to misunderstand him, because they had agreed, somewhere in the last 2 days, to be people who did not pretend to misunderstand each other. "And me," she said. "Yes, I'd think about that if I were you, before they arrive. I'd think very hard about what it does to a man, to his Rule 4, to his careful little doubt, to be wanted by 3 women who could each level a city. Because certainty, Harry, comes in a great many flavors. And the most dangerous one isn't I am right about the weather." She drifted closer until they were a hand's breadth apart in the empty air, and the gold came and went in her eyes, and she said it so quietly that the wind nearly took it. "It's I am loved, therefore I deserve. That's the one that took me, not the star. The feeling right before the star that I had earned the right to want everything. Keep stopping, especially with us. Especially when it feels like the kindest thing in the world not to." And then she pulled back and flew toward the cottage, and left Harry Potter hanging alone over the sea with the most useful and most unwelcome warning anyone had ever given him ringing in the marrow where the god lived. And he hung there a long time before he followed her in, watching the storm he had chosen not to fix roll on toward a coastline that would, that night, get the rain it had always gotten, because he had decided that the world's weather was not yet his to keep. He did not let the warning sit idle, because idleness was a thing Harry Potter had never in his life been good at, and because a tool you fear is a tool you must learn before it learns you. That night, with Jean cross-legged on the hearthrug pretending to read, and in fact watching him over the top of the book with the focus of a woman supervising a man near an open flame, he ran an experiment. He set a single river stone on the kitchen table, smooth and gray and ordinary, the kind of stone that does nothing but exist, and he decided that he would change one thing about it and nothing else. Not improve it, not perfect it. Change its color from gray to blue, the precise blue of a particular morning he remembered, and stop. The discipline was not in the doing was nothing, the doing was easier than breathing. The discipline was in the stopping, in holding the intention to a single attribute while the entity crowded forward with 100 reasonable amendments, suggesting that while they were at it the stone might be made to glow, to sing, to never again be lost, to be the seed of a whole blue country. That a stone was such a small mean thing to be and could so easily be made magnificent, and would Harry not prefer, really in his heart, magnificence to this grey insistence on the merely actual? No, Harry said conversationally to the stone and the entity. Blue, just blue. The stone turned blue, the precise blue of the morning. And then it sat there, grey-shaped and blue-colored and entirely, defiantly unmagnificent, and Harry let out a breath and discovered that he was sweating, that the small act of changing one thing and refusing the other 99 had cost him more than turning the storm had, because the storm had been a single yes, and this had been a yes wrapped around a fortress of number. That, said Jean from the hearthrug, and she had put the book down, is the most important thing I have ever watched anyone do with that power. Do you understand that? You just did the thing it took me a death to learn. You drew a line and you held it for no reason except that you decided to. It wanted to make it sing, Harry said. He turned the blue stone over in his fingers. It really genuinely wanted the stone to be able to sing, and the awful part is that it would have been beautiful and no one would have been hurt, and there is no argument against it except that I said blue and I meant blue. He looked up at her. Is that what it's going to be, the whole of it? Just me saying blue forever while it offers me the music? Jean came and sat across from him and took the blue stone out of his hand and held it, this small, warm proof that a god could be told no, and when she looked up her eyes were wet again and she did not hide it. Yes, she said. That's the whole of it, and you're the first person I've ever met who might be able to do it. She set the stone down between them like a wager neither of them was willing to lose. Don't make it sing, Harry. Whatever happens, however reasonable they make it sound, don't ever make the stone sing. Charles Xavier received Jean's call in his study at the school, with the lamps low and a chessboard in front of him on which he had been, for the better part of an hour, losing very deliberately to a 12-year-old telekinetic who needed to win something today more than Charles needed to keep his record. He took the call in the back of his mind while his face stayed kind and attentive on the game, which is a thing the powerful telepath learns to do or goes mad. It doesn't drive him, Jean told him across the miles. Charles, I've watched it for 2 days. It wants to God, it wants to, I'd let myself forget how much it wants, but he holds it. He made it rules. I watched him turn a stone blue tonight and refused to let it become anything more, and he sweated through it, Charles. He fought for the smallness of it. He treats the corruption like an addiction he's already beaten once. He might be the best thing that ever happened to that fire. Or, Charles agreed gently when she did not finish. Or he's the most powerful being on earth and he's 3 days old and the only person teaching him is me, and I am. She let him feel it, the thing under the words, because there had never been much point hiding from Charles. I am not objective about him. I want you to know that, before you decide anything. I came to assess a threat and I stayed because I like the way he argues and I have not been able to make myself leave, and you should factor that into whatever you decide because I can't promise I'm seeing him clearly. Charles Xavier moved a bishop into a position from which his young opponent could, if she saw it, win in 3 moves, and he hoped she would see it, and he turned the larger part of his attention to the woman he had raised from a frightened girl into the most powerful psychic on the planet, and then helped, painstakingly, to survive being exactly that. You are seeing him more clearly than anyone else possibly could, he told her, because you are the only person alive who knows what he is looking at when he looks into that fire. Your lack of objectivity is not a flaw in your assessment, Jean. It is your assessment. He paused. I'm sending Auror and Emma. Not to seize him, to stand with you, and to be 3 sets of eyes instead of 1, and because if the Shi'ar have felt this, and they have, then a host who stands alone will not stand long, and I would rather Harry Potter face an empire with the X-Men beside him than without. Aurora will steady him. And Emma will complicate everything, Jean said with a dryness that surprised her. Emma, Charles said with the ghost of his own dry humor, will test him in ways neither you nor Aurora can, because she will not be kind to him, and a man who is only ever met with kindness never learns where his edges are. He withdrew gently, as he always did, leaving the warmth of his regard behind like a hand briefly on a shoulder. Be careful, Jean, all 3 of you. And Jean, he hesitated, and then said the thing because he had learned across a long life that the unsaid thing is the one that ambushes you. If he is what you hope, then we have been given a gift the universe does not usually give twice. And if he is what I fear, then you are closer to it than anyone, and you of all people know how that ends. Hold both. Don't choose between them yet. He deserves to be seen whole, and so do you. He returned fully to the chessboard. The 12-year-old had found the winning line. Her face, when she saw it, when she understood that she had genuinely beaten him and that he had not let her, lit up with a fierce, uncomplicated joy that was, Charles thought, the entire reason he had built this place, the radiant moment of a child discovering she was more than she feared. He thought of Harry Potter on his cliff, who had perhaps never once in his life been allowed such a moment, who had gone straight from cupboard to war to godhood with no intervening interval of simply being a person learning he was good at something. He hoped, with the part of him that was not a strategist and not a general and not the most powerful mind on earth, but only an old man who had spent his life loving difficult, dangerous, frightened children into their strength, that someone over there was teaching the new host how to be happy. He need not have worried about that particular thing. But there were a great many other things to worry about, and the considerate narrator, who can see the Bird Empire's warships even now adjusting their long cold trajectories toward a small blue world, will let the old man have his evening of chess and the small triumphant child, because peace in this story is a thing measured in evenings, and there were not going to be very many more of them. That night Harry dreamed, as he had known he would, of the woman with the red hair. Not Jean, the other one. The first one, the one the entity had loved into a god and watched become a horror. Though the dream did not show him the horror, the dream was merciful in a way the entity's waking memories had not been, and showed him instead a moment from before. A woman standing at the rail of a starship with the light of a nebula on her face, laughing at something ordinary and luminous and alive, with the fire still small and sweet inside her like a held breath, like a promise, like the moment before. Harry understood in the dream that he was being shown this on purpose. The entity was not above curating. It wanted him to see what it had loved before so that he would understand what it grieved, and he was clever even in dreams. It was perhaps his most exhausting quality, so that he would understand what it was very gently, very patiently, hoping to find again. "You want me to be her," Harry said in the dream to the fire. "No," said the fire in the wordless grammar that was the only language it deigned to use. "I want you to let me love you the way I loved her. That is a different thing. She did not survive being loved by me. I am asking you to be the one who does. I have been alone for a very long time, Harry Potter, and you are the first house I have lived in that argues with me, and I find," the dream nebula turned, vast and slow and indifferent overhead, "I find I would rather be argued with for an age than worshipped for an hour. Teach me to love something without unmaking it. Neither of us knows how. We will have to learn it together. That is Rule 4, the one the woman gave you on the cliff, the one you have not finished understanding. Everything near you becomes more itself. So become the kind of thing worth becoming more of, and then let the ones who are near you do the same. That is the whole of it. That is the only rule that matters." Harry woke before dawn with the taste of starlight in his mouth, and the certain knowledge that the fire had just told him the truth. And the equally certain knowledge that the fire telling him the truth was, in its own way, the most seductive and dangerous thing it had done yet. Because a power that lies to you you can resist, but a power that loves you and tells you the truth and asks only to be taught how to love you better is a power that has found the one door in a man that does not have a lock. He got up. He made tea the ordinary way. Jean was already in the kitchen, wrapped in one of his jumpers, having clearly also not slept, and she looked at his face and knew exactly what he had dreamed, because she had dreamed it too, for years, the woman at the rail of the ship, and they sat together in the gray pre-dawn with their hands around their cups and did not speak, because there was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying better. And outside the window the impossible garden turned its faces east to wait for a sun that was still an hour from rising, patient as a congregation, reaching for a light that had not yet come, but that they had decided, all of them, every green and growing thing in that small scorched circle, was worth reaching for anyway. Far overhead, beyond the weather, beyond the air, in the long cold dark where the Bird Empire's vanguard had crossed the orbit of the outermost planet and begun, with the unhurried certainty of a verdict already written, its final approach, something ancient and imperial turned its many eyes toward a small blue world and prepared to do what it had always done to worlds that caught fire. But the sun came up first. It always does in the end come up first. And Harry Potter and Jean Grey drank their tea and watched it, and for the length of one more dawn, the watching was enough. Chapter 2 ends Chapter 3, The White Queen and the Storm. The X-Men's aircraft did not so much land on Harry's cliff as condescend to it, settling onto the grass with the contained arrogance of a very expensive machine accustomed to landing in places that had not asked for it. And out of it stepped two women who could each, as Jean had promised, level a city, and who were already, before either had spoken a word, conducting two entirely different campaigns. The first wore white. She wore it the way a blade wears light, which is to say that the whiteness was not innocence but its precise and deliberate opposite, a flag planted to announce that nothing here would mark her, that she had walked into furnaces before and come out with her hem clean. Emma Frost crossed the wet Cornish grass in heels that had no business on a cliff top and were not, you understood at once, going to apologize for it, and she did not look at the cottage or the impossible flowers or the gray churning sea. She looked at Harry. She looked at him the way a safecracker looks at a safe she has been told cannot be opened, with a hunger that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the lock. And Harry, who had been warned, felt the first delicate exploratory pressure against the walls of his mind before she had finished her third step. He let her find the wall. He did not slam a door, because slamming a door tells the burglar where the door is. He simply was in the place where his thoughts lived, a smooth and seamless and entirely closed surface, warm to the touch and absolute, and he watched her watch her own probe slide off it, and he saw the exact moment she understood that the rumor was true. "Well," said Emma Frost, stopping a precise and theatrical 6 feet away, tilting her head as she regarded him. Her voice was cut glass over something molten. "Aren't you a disappointment to all my expectations? I came expecting a frightened boy sitting on a bomb. Charles does so love to send me to manage frightened boys." Instead, she let the word hang. Her eyes moved over him, the cottage, the garden, the woman standing at his shoulder, and came back to him, and there was a heat in them now that had not been there at the aircraft. "Instead, I find a locked room. Do you have the faintest idea, darling, how long it has been since I met a locked room? I had begun to think the species extinct." "Jean warned me about you," Harry said. "Jean warns everyone about me. It's practically my introduction." "What did she say?" "That you try to read every secret I have within 30 seconds because that's how you say hello, and that when you failed you'd find it irresistible." He considered her, and the entity in him considered her too, with its ancient patient interest, and found, to Harry's faint alarm, that it agreed with the assessment. She was right on the first count. We'll see about the second. Emma Frost smiled, and it was a real one and a dangerous one, the smile of a woman who has just been handed a worthy opponent after a long famine of unworthy ones. "Oh," she said, soft and pleased and absolutely awake. "Oh, I am going to enjoy you." And then the second woman spoke, and the wind changed. It changed because she willed it to, gently, a courtesy and a demonstration at once. The gray overcast peeling back from directly above the cliff to admit a single shaft of clean gold light that fell not by accident on the place where she stood, so that Aurora Munro was lit like an icon while the rest of them stood in shadow. And if you think this was vanity, you have misunderstood her entirely. It was instruction. It was a queen showing a new and untaught power exactly how much control looked like when control had been practiced for 30 years instead of 3 days. Her white hair lifted in a wind that touched nothing else. Her eyes, when she turned them on Harry, were the flat pale blue of a sky before lightning, and they held no hunger at all, which was in its own way far more unnerving than Emma's. "You turned to Storm 2 days ago," Storm said. Her voice was low and unhurried and carried the cadence of someone who had been, at various points in a long and storied life, a thief, a goddess, and a queen, and had found the goddess part the least interesting of the three. 40 miles out. "You opened it like a window to show Jean a patch of sun, and then you closed it again, and you let the coast have its reign." "I did. Why did you close it?" The question was not idle. Harry understood that the entire reason this woman had crossed an ocean was folded into it, that she had come to take this single measurement, and that everything else would follow from the answer. The entity stirred, offering him the impressive reply, the cosmic reply, the reply that would establish dominance. He set it aside. "Because it wasn't mine to keep open," he said. "The rain belongs to the coast. I was borrowing the sky to make a point, and you don't keep things you've borrowed." Storm regarded him for a long moment with those pale, pre-lightning eyes, and the shaft of gold light around her dimmed by a degree, which Harry would only later learn was the nearest thing she gave to approval on a first meeting. "Most men," she said, "who can touch the weather, learn first to make it serve them. It took me years to learn to ask it instead of command it, longer to learn that the asking is the whole of the art, that a sky compelled is a sky that resents you, and resentment in a thing the size of weather is how people drown. You arrived at borrowing in 3 days. She inclined her head very slightly, a gesture from a woman who did not bestow them lightly. "I came here prepared to be your jailer, Harry Potter, if it came to that. Jean asked me to come as a friend. I will tell you honestly that I had not decided which I would be until you answered that question. I have decided. And I will tell you when I trust you," Storm said with the serene finality of weather, "which is not today. But I have decided you are worth the trouble of finding out." She glanced at Emma, and something passed between the two women, old and wry and unspoken. "Which is more than I can say for the company you keep. Aurora adores me," Emma said to Harry confidingly. "She expresses it through threats. It's very moving." This, then, was the household that assembled itself on a Cornish cliff over the following days, and the narrator confesses a certain fondness for the spectacle of it, because there are few things in this universe more entertaining than watching 4 extraordinarily powerful people attempt to share a kitchen. There is a particular comedy to powerful people in a small kitchen, and the narrator, who has promised you tonal whiplash and intends to deliver it, would be remiss not to linger on it before the Empire arrives and ruins everyone's morning. Consider the matter of breakfast. Emma Frost did not cook on principle, the principle being that she had not clawed her way out of poverty and the Hellfire Club and several literal fires in order to stand over a pan. She sat at the table and critiqued. Storm cooked as she did everything, with a serene competence that made the eggs seem grateful to be eaten. Jean burned toast and was unrepentant about it. And Harry, who had been raised by people who treated him as kitchen staff and had spent the intervening years discovering that he rather liked cooking when it was a choice instead of a sentence, made a full English with the quiet pride of a man performing a small mastery he had actually earned the slow human way. "It's obscene," Emma announced on the third morning watching him plate it, "that the most powerful being on the planet can be relied upon for a decent fry-up. It humanizes you intolerably. I came here to be intrigued by a god, and instead I am being fed by a competent flatmate. Do you know what that does to the narrative?" "You could help," Harry suggested. "I could," Emma agreed and did not move, and stole a mushroom off his plate with telekinetic precision he was fairly sure she'd used purely to show off. "But then where would we be? Anarchy, standards collapse. Next you'll want me to be nice to Auror." "Heaven forbid," said Storm, not looking up from her tea. "She's warming to me," Emma told Harry in the tone of a woman sharing a great confidence. "Underneath the glacial contempt there is genuine glacial affection. It's taken me 11 years. I'm very patient." "You are the least patient person I have ever met," said Jean from the toast she was again burning. "I am patient about the things that matter and insufferable about everything else. It's called priorities, darling." But Emma's eyes had drifted to Harry as she said it, and the play in them had banked into something quieter, and Harry felt it, the way the room kept tilting toward him. 3 brilliant and dangerous women orbiting a center none of them had quite agreed to name. And he felt the entity feel it too, with its vast and patient pleasure, and he heard under the warmth the reasonable, patient voice that he had learned to fear most. "How easily you could make them stay. How easily you could make them sure. A thought, a touch of the fire, and not one of them would ever want to leave you. Would that be so cruel? They are already halfway there. You would only be helping." "No," Harry said aloud into the bright kitchen to the voice, and 3 women looked up at him, and he realized he had said it where they could hear, and he did not take it back because he had decided to be honest where he could afford to be. "Not you," he said. It offers about everything. I'm telling it, number." He set down the pan. "Whatever this turns into, it's going to turn into it because you chose it with your own minds, not because I warmed the room. I need you to know I'll always tell it no about that, especially about that." The kitchen was quiet. Storm set down her tea. Jean had stopped pretending to mind the toast. And Emma Frost, who trusted nothing and no one, and had built a life out of the certainty that everyone could eventually be read and therefore owned, looked at a man who had just told her that the one power that could have guaranteed her devotion was the one power he would never use on her, and felt something shift in the diamond architecture of her that had not shifted in a very long time. "Well," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, and she let them hear it. "That's the most attractive thing anyone has ever refused to do to me." She picked up her fork. "Eat your breakfast, Potter. Apparently we have a galaxy to disappoint." They could not all stay in the cottage, of course. It had 2 bedrooms and a temperament. So Harry did the thing he had been carefully not letting himself do, the thing that was either the most natural use of his power or the first step down a road with a star at the bottom of it, and he was not yet sure which, and the uncertainty was the only thing that made it safe. He built them rooms. He did it slowly, with Jean watching and Storm watching more skeptically, and Emma watching with the frank acquisitive interest of a woman pricing a thing she intends to own. He did not conjure a palace, though he could have, though the entity pressed a palace upon him with great enthusiasm, a palace of singing crystal and impossible light, a palace worthy of the women who would live in it. He built instead an extension to a small cottage, 3 more rooms in the same gray local stone with the same low beams and the same drafty charm, indistinguishable from the original except that they had not existed an hour before. He made them ordinary on purpose. He made them ordinary as he had made the stone only blue, as an act of discipline disguised as an act of creation, and Storm, who missed nothing, watched him refuse the palace and understood precisely what the refusal had cost and what it had bought. "You could have given us a palace," she observed that evening when the new wing smelled of fresh stone and old hearth and the 4 of them sat with the wine Emma had produced from somewhere on the principle that she did not travel into hardship. "The fire wanted to, and you said," "I said cottage." Harry turned his glass in his fingers. "It's the same fight every time. It offers me the magnificent version of the kind thing, and I take the small one and I keep the difference. The difference is where I still live. The The day I let it talk me into the palace is the day there's a little less of me and a little more of it, and you do that enough times and one morning you wake up and you are just the fire wearing a face. Emma Frost set down her wine. The molten thing under the cut glass had gone still and attentive. That, she said, is the single most lucid description of the death of a self I have ever heard, and I have spent 40 years living inside other people's heads watching it happen the slow way. Where did you learn it? I had a piece of a dark wizard's soul living in my head for 16 years, Harry said mildly. You learn the difference between your own thoughts and a guest's. You learn it or the guest wins. He felt Emma's attention sharpen, felt her store the fact away with the avidity of a collector, and he let her, because he had decided something about Emma Frost in the 2 days he had known her, which was that she could be trusted precisely as far as she found him interesting, and that the surest way to keep her loyal was to never ever bore her. You can stop trying to get in, by the way, he added. You've been knocking the whole time we've been talking. It's a very polite knock. I appreciate the technique. It's not going to work. The room went quiet. Storm's mouth curved. Jean on the window seat made a sound into her wine that she converted, not quite in time, into a cough. Emma Frost looked at Harry Potter for a long moment, and then she laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised and entirely without ice, and the laugh transformed her face into something younger and more dangerous and considerably more honest. Caught, she said. Guilty. I have been knocking for 2 days, darling, with everything I have, because I genuinely cannot remember the last time a door said no to me and meant it. Do you know what it does to a woman like me to find a thing she cannot have? She leaned forward, and the firelight moved on the white of her, and her eyes did not leave his. It makes her want to stay until she does. Emma, said Jean, and there was a warning in it, and also the narrator notes with interest, not very much of one. I'm being honest, Jean. He values honesty, he said so. I'm adapting to my environment. Emma sat back unhurried, queenly, having planted exactly the flag she'd meant to plant. Besides, we have rather more pressing things to discuss than whether I am flirting with the most powerful being on the planet, which I am, and which he is handling with a composure I find frankly infuriating. Her tone changed, the play draining out of it, leaving the strategist beneath. Charles felt something this morning, so did I on the way here. Auror. I felt it in the upper air, Storm said quietly. 3 nights ago, when he was bonded, the sky over this place rang like a struck bell, and the ringing went up, past the weather, past the air, into the dark. I have spent my life listening to the sky. I know the difference between an echo and an answer. She set down her glass. Something answered, Harry. Something very far away and very large turned toward the sound you made when you were born into that power, and it has been getting closer ever since, and it is not coming to welcome you. Harry was quiet. He had felt it too, of course. He had felt it since the first morning. The storm front at the edge of his new and enormous perceptions, a coldness with a shape, a vast deliberate attention crossing the dark toward a small blue world. He had been not thinking about it with the same discipline he applied to the palace and the singing stone. The Shi'ar, Jean said. The word came out of her with a weight that made Harry turn. Her face had changed, the warmth had gone somewhere far back behind her eyes, and what stood in its place was older. It's the Shi'ar. Tell me it isn't Auror. I cannot tell you that. What are the Shi'ar? Harry asked into the silence that followed, and it was Jean who answered, because it was Jean's to answer, because she was the only person in the room, in the country, on the planet, who had stood where the answer led. An empire, she said. An old one, older than anything human. They rule a good portion of a galaxy that isn't ours, and they are not mostly monsters, which is the part people never understand. They have art and law and a kind of terrible beauty. But they have one article of faith that they will burn worlds to defend, and it is this, that the Phoenix Force is the single greatest threat to all existence, that it has ended realities, that it cannot be contained and cannot be reformed and cannot be allowed a host. She was not looking at any of them now. She was looking at a memory. I know this because they put me on trial for it, the whole of their court, their guard, their empress. They sat in judgment on a galaxy's behalf, and they decided that the phoenix in me had to die, and that I had to die with it, because there was no way to have the one without the other. Her hands were very still around her glass. I agreed with them in the end. That's the part no one likes to hear. I stood in front of the empire that wanted me dead, and I looked at what the fire had done through me, the star, the billions, and I agreed with them, and I chose to die. And the fire brought me back anyway, because that is what it does, and so here we are. And now it has chosen you, and they will have felt it, and they are coming, and they will not put you on trial, Harry, because they learned their lesson with me. They will not give the host a chance to choose. They will simply burn this world to be sure. The fire came up in Harry then. It came up unbidden, a thing he had not summoned, a vast and immediate and entirely sincere readiness to meet an empire in the dark and unmake it utterly before it could lay a finger on the woman across the room or the world she had chosen to die to protect. And the readiness was so total and so righteous and so warm that for one full second Harry Potter forgot to doubt it. For 1 second he was certain, and the cottage filled with light. The fire poured out of him, not as flame but as presence, as a pressure of pure capability that made the wineglasses sing and the new stone groan and the impossible flowers outside turn all at once to face the window. And Storm came to her feet with the wind rising white around her, and Emma's skin flashed to living diamond in pure reflex. And Jean did not rise. Jean did not armor herself. Jean said Harry very quietly into the rising roar, the single syllable of his name, and underneath it, mind to mind, where only he could hear, I know exactly how it feels. It feels like love. It feels like the most justified thing you have ever wanted. That is the feeling. That is the one. Stop the stone from singing. And Harry Potter, standing at the center of a cottage full of light with an empire's death in his open hands and the perfect righteous certainty of it singing in his blood, heard her and remembered the blue stone, and did the hardest thing he had done since the bonding, which was to doubt himself in the exact moment that doubt felt like cowardice. He let the certainty go. The light drained back into him. The glasses stopped singing. The stone settled. Storm's wind fell still, and Emma's diamond softened back to skin, and the four of them stood in a cottage that smelled of ozone and fear, and Harry sat down rather suddenly in his chair and put his face in his hands and breathed. That's the one, Jean said again, aloud now, gently, to the room and to him. That's what it did to me, right there, that exact feeling, except I didn't have anyone in the room who knew to say my name. Nobody spoke for a while. Outside, the flowers slowly turned back toward the dark. Well, said Emma Frost at last, and her voice had lost every trace of its cut-glass play, and what remained was quiet and certain, and the narrator is moved to report, kind. Now I understand why Charles sent 3 of us. You don't need jailers, Harry Potter. And you don't need worshippers, God knows you'll get enough of those. You need 3 women who will look at you in the worst moment of your life, when you are holding the power to fix everything and burning to use it, and say number. She picked her wine back up. Her hand was not quite steady, and she let them see it, which from Emma Frost was a confession of enormous proportions. How fortunate. I have never in my life been able to resist telling a powerful man number. In the gray hour after that first frightening night, when no one in the cottage was sleeping and pretending otherwise had become a group activity, Storm took Harry up onto the cliff and taught him to be small. That was how she put it. You have learned to stop, she said, standing barefoot on the wet turf with the dawn a rumor at the edge of the sea, her white hair perfectly still in air that should have moved it. Jean taught you that, and it is the most important lesson, and it will keep you human. But stopping is a wall, Harry, and a wall is a thing that can be pushed down. I am going to teach you the other discipline, not how to refuse the power. How to make it small without refusing it. How to hold a great deal of fire and choose to be a candle. That sounds harder than refusing it. It is the hardest thing I know, Storm agreed, and I have been doing it since I was a girl who could call hurricanes and lived in a desert that needed rain and learned, the difficult way, what happens to the people downwind of a child's generosity. Watch. She raised one hand and the storm came. It came out of a clear dawn at her invitation, clouds boiling up from nothing in a hard black anvil that climbed the sky in seconds. Lightning stitching its belly, the temperature crashing, the sea below rising into white confusion, and Harry felt the entity in him stir and strain toward it with delight, recognizing kin, wanting to answer thunder with thunder. And then Storm closed her hand, slowly, and the whole apocalyptic architecture of it folded back down, not dispersed but concentrated, gathered, until what remained over her open palm was a single drop of rain, trembling, holding all the intention of the storm in a thing the size of a tear. Everything the storm was, she said quietly, is in the drop. I did not throw the power away. I did not refuse it. I made it small and I kept all of it, and the difference between the storm and the drop is not power. It is courtesy. It is the decision to be exactly as large as the moment requires and not 1 degree larger. She turned her palm and let the drop fall into the grass. You build cottages instead of palaces. Good. Now learn to build the cottage with the whole weight of the palace inside it, held, chosen, ready, and never spent. That is what it means to master a thing instead of fearing it. Fear refuses. Mastery measures. Harry tried. He raised his hand and reached for the smallest possible thing. A single drop of rain conjured from the morning air, and the entity poured forward with such enthusiasm that the drop became a deluge. A column of water crashing down on the cliff that soaked them both to the skin in an instant and made Storm laugh. A real laugh, low and surprised and warm, the first he had heard from her. Too much, she said, wringing out her cloak with regal unconcern. Always at first too much. The fire does not know how to be small. Smallness is the one thing in creation it has never wanted to be. You will have to teach it. You will have to want the drop more than it wants the flood, and you will have to want it every single time, because the day you let it give you the flood because the flood is easier is the day it begins to choose your size for you. She put her wet hand briefly against his cheek, a gesture of startling tenderness from a woman carved out of weather. I think you can do it. I did not think so when I landed. I thought I had come to put down a god. Instead, I find a man learning to be a candle and asking me how. Try again. He tried again. By the time the others came up onto the cliff with tea and complaints about the hour, Harry Potter had made, over his open palm, exactly 1 drop of rain, and he was looking at it with the particular fierce, private joy of a man who has spent his whole life being told he is too much and has just, for the first time, been precisely enough. Storm caught Jean's eye over his bent head and inclined her own, fractionally, and Jean understood the whole of what the gesture meant, which was, he will not become what we feared. Not while he is willing to learn to be small. Hold on to that. We are going to need it. Emma, watching from the cottage door with a cup she had not offered to share, said nothing at all, which from Emma was the loudest thing she could have done. We must not neglect the dark wizard who was, that same night, several hundred miles away, learning patience. Voldemort's body had finished growing. He stood now in the bricktop room, a tall pale wrongness in robes that hung on a frame not quite remembered correctly by the ritual that had made it, and he flexed long white fingers and found them obedient, and he turned the full and terrible apparatus of his restored mind to the problem of Harry Potter, and he was pleased because the problem was, he had concluded, solvable after all. He fears it, Voldemort said. His followers knelt in the dark, he barely saw them. He was thinking aloud, which he did only when the thought was good enough to deserve an audience. My spies were right. The boy with the power of a star spends his every waking hour holding it back, terrified of what he might become. He has made it rules. He surrounds himself with women who help him hold the leash. The pale lips curved. Do you understand what that means, Avery? It means the power is real, and it means he will not use it. A weapon its bearer dares not fire is no weapon at all. It is a liability he must defend. And a man defending a liability he is afraid of is the easiest man in the world to break, because you do not have to defeat his strength. You have only to frighten him into using it badly. My lord, ventured the bravest of the kneeling shapes, if his power is as you say, how can we hope to? We do not fight the fire, Voldemort said with the patience of a teacher addressing a slow but valued pupil. We fight the man. The fire cannot be coerced, but the man can be grieved. And a grieving man with the power of a god is a man who will, in his grief, reach for that power without his careful rules. And in that moment, Avery, in that single, unguarded moment when he burns in fury instead of in discipline, the fire will turn on him as it turns on all of them, and it will begin to eat him from the inside. I have read the histories the goblins keep of such things. The phoenix does not destroy its hosts. It seduces them into destroying themselves. He turned from the bricked window, and the candlelight found the red of his eyes. We will not touch Harry Potter. We will take something he loves, and we will make him watch, and we will let the fire do the rest. The whole of the wizarding world will see the great savior become the thing that burned it, and into that ruin I will step, the only power left standing, the one who warned them. He smiled fully now. It is, you will agree, a considerable improvement on my previous strategies, which relied overmuch on killing him myself. It was a good plan. The narrator wishes it were not, but the narrator has promised you honesty, and honesty requires the admission that Voldemort, freed at last from the compulsion to be the one holding the wand, had become a far more dangerous thing, a patient one. He did not yet know about the Empire crossing the dark. He did not know that there were now larger appetites than his circling the same small flame. He knew only that there was a man in Cornwall who could remake the world and was too frightened to. And that fear in Voldemort's long and pitiless experience was the only lever that had ever reliably moved anyone. He set his servants to finding the thing Harry Potter loved most. It did not take them long. The whole of Britain knew the names of Harry Potter's friends. The Shi'ar scout came down 2 nights later, and it came down beautifully, which is the cruelest thing about the Shi'ar. Even their executioners have grace. Harry felt it first, the cold, deliberate attention resolving from a storm front into a single descending point, and he was on the cliff before the others, barefoot in the wet grass with the sea roaring below, looking up at a sky that had begun, very high, to glow. Then Storm was beside him, and Jean and Emma in a coat thrown over white silk, and the 4 of them watched a shape descend through the cloud deck wreathed in its own re-entry fire, slowing as no falling thing should slow until it hung above the cliff. A vessel of pale gold and blue, all curves and pinions, beautiful as a bird and silent as a verdict, and from it descended on a column of light a single figure. He was enormous, and he was blue, and he wore the colors of an empire that had judged Jean Grey and found her guilty. And when his boots touched the grass the ground did not dare to mark. He looked at the 4 of them with eyes that held no malice, which was somehow worse, and when he spoke his voice was the voice of a man reading a sentence already passed. I am Gladiator, he said, praetor of the Imperial Guard, and I have come on the authority of the Magistrix and the will of the Shi'ar Imperium. His gaze moved across them and settled on Harry, and there was in it a terrible and genuine regret. I had hoped the readings were wrong. They are never wrong. He inclined his great head in executioner's courtesy. Host of the Phoenix, by the law of 1,000 worlds, you and the fire you carry are condemned. I have come to give your world the one mercy my orders permit, the chance to surrender you and the fire so that only one death is necessary instead of a billion. His eyes went briefly to Jean, and something crossed them, recognition, memory, and old grief of his own. We have done this before, you and I, he said to her quietly. I had hoped never again, so had I, Jean said. And Harry Potter stepped forward, barefoot on his own cliff, with 3 women at his back and an empire's headsman before him and a god banked and waiting in his marrow. And he discovered that he was not afraid, and he made a careful private note to be suspicious of that later, because the absence of fear he was learning was exactly the condition the fire liked best. You came a long way to deliver a choice that isn't one, Harry said. Surrender and one of us dies, or refuse and a billion do. I notice you didn't include the third option. Gladiator's brow creased, the faint puzzlement of a being unused to negotiation. There is no third option. There's always a third option, Harry said. It's just usually the one nobody in charge wants you to think of. He tilted his head, and behind his calm the great mind turned over the shape of an empire, a law, a headsman who regretted his orders, and a fire that wanted very badly to show this beautiful blue executioner exactly what it could do. He held the fire still. He smiled instead, the dry and dangerous smile of a man who had spent his life being underestimated by people who outgunned him. Tell me about your Majestrix, Harry said. Tell me who I'd have to convince. Because I'm not going to surrender and you're not going to burn this world, and so the only question left, Peter, is which of us is going to have the more interesting conversation with your Empress. And I should warn you. The gold gathered at the edges of him, gently, a banked sun behind a man's skin. I'm told I'm very hard to say no to. You speak as though there is room to bargain, Gladiator said, and for the first time something moved in the great calm face, a weariness older than the empire he served. There is not. I have stood where you stand. I have heard hosts promise restraint, promise mastery, promise that this time the fire has met its match. I believed one of them once. His eyes went to Jean and stayed. I believed her. I argued for her against my own orders against the throne, and then I watched the fire take her anyway, and I watched a star die, and I learned that the kindest thing the Imperium ever does is not to believe the host, because the host always means it. The host is never lying, and the host always loses. Storm stepped up beside Harry then, and the wind came with her, and the gold light of the Shi'ar vessel found the white of her hair and made of her something that the praetor of the Imperial Guard, who had knelt before empresses, regarded with visible and involuntary respect. I am Aurora Munro, she said, and I have ruled and I have stolen, and I have called the lightning down on men who deserved it and wept for the ones who did not, and I am telling you, praetor, soldier to soldier, that you are wrong about this one. I have spent 3 days teaching him to be small. He learns. Do you understand what I am telling you? The fire wants the flood, and he chooses the drop again and again, and he chooses it when no one is watching, which is the only time the choosing counts. I want to believe you, Gladiator said, and the awful thing was that he meant it. And Emma Frost, who had been silent, who had been doing the thing she did better than anyone alive, said, into all their minds at once, gently, so that even Gladiator startled, I have been inside his head. I have been against the outside of his head, beating on it like a woman locked out in the cold for 3 days because he will not let me in, and do you know why he will not let me in, praetor? Not because he has something to hide. Because he is afraid that if a telepath as strong as I am gets inside and finds the fire will reach back down the connection and take me too. He locks his mind to protect the woman trying to burgle it. She looked at Gladiator with her chin lifted and her white coat snapping in storm's wind. That is not a man the fire has taken. That is a man the fire is going to have to fight for every inch of, with 3 of us standing on his chest. Go home and tell your Empress that. Tell her the math has changed. For a long moment the executioner of the Shi'ar Imperium stood on a Cornish cliff and looked at the 4 of them, the host and the 3 women who would not move, and the regret in his face deepened into something that was almost grief. I cannot go home, Gladiator said at last, simply. Those are not my orders. My orders are to offer the surrender, and when it is refused, to signal the fleet. He lifted one hand, not in threat but in apology, and high above, the beautiful golden ship began very faintly to glow. I am sorry. I have argued for a host before, and I was wrong, and a star died for my mercy. I will not be wrong twice. The fleet will arrive in 3 of your days. I would beg you to use them to say your farewells, but I think instead you will use them to prepare, and I find that I am glad of it, though it is treason to be glad. He inclined his head a final time, the headsman's last courtesy. "Make me wrong, Harry Potter. I have wanted for a very long time to be wrong about the Phoenix. Make me wrong, and I will tell the Empire I have served for 1,000 years that it has spent that 1,000 years afraid of the wrong thing." Above them, the beautiful golden ship hung silent against the stars, and behind it, far out in the dark, the rest of the Imperial Guard waited, and behind them an empire, and behind the empire 1,000,000,000 years of certainty that the thing in Harry Potter could end everything. And on the cliff, 4 people stood between that certainty and a small blue world, and the night held its breath to see what the new host would do with the power he was so frightened to use. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4 A Lesser Darkness. They had 3 days to prepare for an empire, and Voldemort, with the exquisite bad timing of a man who has waited years for his moment, and refuses to recognize that a larger moment has arrived, chose the first of them to make his move. It is one of the small cruelties of how power distributes itself in the universe that the Dark Wizard never knew, never once suspected, that he had become a footnote. He believed that morning that he was the principal threat to Harry Potter's existence, the great antagonist of Potter's life come round at last for its final reckoning. He had no inkling of the golden ship that had hung over the Cornish cliff, no notion of the fleet crossing the dark, no concept that the being he intended to break with grief was at that moment dividing his attention between a Midlands manor and the orbital mechanics of an alien armada. Voldemort thought he was the story. The narrator finds this both pitiable and instructive and invites you to hold it in mind, because there is a lesson in it for anyone who has ever been certain of their own centrality. The universe is under no obligation to agree with you about your importance, and it frequently doesn't. Harry felt it as he now felt everything within a few hundred miles. As a disturbance in the great web of living minds his perception had become, a knot of fear and pain blooming suddenly in a farmhouse in Devon. 2 minds he knew, 2 minds he had known for half his life, going from the ordinary background hum of a Tuesday morning into the white spike of terror, and around them the cold, deliberate malice of a dozen others. He was on his feet before the teacup finished falling. "Ron and Hermione," he said. His voice had gone somewhere very flat and very quiet. "They've taken Ron and Hermione." Jean was already moving. "Where?" "Devon." "The Burrows wards. They got through the Burrows wards. That should be impossible. He stopped, because the entity had surged up in him at the word taken, surged with a readiness so total and so welcome that it nearly carried him off his feet, and he recognized it. And he was so frightened by how good it felt that he did the thing Storm had taught him and made himself, with enormous effort, small. He stood in the kitchen and breathed and held a god the size of a galaxy down to the dimensions of a single furious man. "It's a trap," he said. "Obviously it's a trap. They want me angry. They want me to come in burning." "Then don't," said Storm. "They have my friends." "Then come in cold," Storm said, and crossed to him and took his face in her hands as she had on the cliff, and her pale eyes held his until the worst of the heat went out of them. "Listen to me. You taught the fire to make the drop instead of the flood. This is the moment that lesson is for, not the Empire, Harry. This. A man who has hurt the people you love, dangling them in front of you precisely so that you will reach for everything. If you arrive as the Storm, you will give him exactly what he wants, and you will give the fire exactly the opening it has been waiting for. So arrive as the drop, be small, be precise. Be so much less than you are that he never sees the rest of you coming." "We're coming with you," Jean said. "It was not a question. It's a trap meant for me." "Which is why you're not walking into it alone, you magnificent idiot," said Emma Frost, already shrugging into her coat, already white and sharp and entirely awake. Did the cleverest man on the planet genuinely just suggest he face an ambush by himself because it would be rude to involve his friends? "Auror, talk to him. He respects you. I'm merely decorative and devastating." "You are not merely anything," Storm said, "and he knows it, and so do you. We go together. Jean and I will take the Death Eaters. Emma will hold the minds, theirs and his, so that nothing in that house can lie to us. And you, Harry," she held his gaze, "you will do the one thing none of us can do. You will end it, and you will end it small, and you will not let the fire turn your grief into a star. We will be there to remind you. That is what we are for. That is what we came for." Harry looked at the 3 of them, arrayed in his kitchen, a goddess and a queen and a telepath who had been a villain, all of them choosing, with their own minds, to walk into a trap built for him, and he felt the entity offer to simply remove them from the danger, to set them down somewhere safe and far away with a thought, for their own good, and he told it no. Because they had not asked to be protected, and a man who decides what is good for the people he loves without asking them is a man already halfway to deciding what is good for everyone. "All right," he said, "together." And quietly, He picked up the fallen teacup and set it on the table and did not notice that he had mended the crack in it without trying, but Emma did and stored the fact away because Emma stored everything away. The farmhouse in Devon sat in a fold of green hills under a sky that Storm examined on arrival and found wrong. A sky held artificially clear by wards designed to keep the weather out, which told her a great deal about how thoroughly the trap had been prepared, and how little its designers understood the woman about to dismantle it. They arrived without sound, without the crack of apparition, simply stepping out of a fold in space that Harry held open and closed behind them, into the long grass at the edge of the property. The Death Eaters were waiting. Of course they were waiting. The entire point of a trap is to be waiting. There were 14 of them ringed around the farmhouse, masked and robed and confident, and in the doorway, flanked by 2 more, stood the tall pale wrongness that called itself Lord Voldemort, restored to a body in a terrible smiling composure, and in front of him, on their knees, bound and gagged and alive, were Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger. Harry felt the world go very simple. This is what the fire does, you understand. It offers simplicity, and simplicity in a crisis is the most seductive drug there is. Everything in him narrowed to the 2 kneeling figures and the smiling thing behind them, and the narrowing felt like clarity, and the clarity wanted only one thing, and the one thing was fire. "Harry Potter," said Voldemort, and his high cold voice carried across the grass with the relish of a man who has rehearsed this moment in the dark for years. "I confess I was not certain you would come. A god, they tell me, a god who hides on a cliff and makes rules. I wondered whether the god would trouble himself for a blood traitor and a mudblood." He let the slurs land, watching Harry's face for the flinch, for the flare, for the opening. "But here you are, sentiment. It was always going to be sentiment with you. Your mother died of it. I had rather hoped you'd grown out of it, but number." He laid one long white finger against Hermione's temple, and she did not flinch, because Hermione Granger had stared down worse than this, and the narrator will not have her diminished. But Ron made a sound behind his gag, a low furious sound, and strained against his bonds. "Now, here is the arithmetic, godling. You are going to show me the power. You are going to demonstrate fully, completely, the inheritance you stole so that I may understand precisely what I am dealing with. Or I am going to begin, with your clever friend, to take this house apart one screaming piece at a time. The choice, as ever, is yours. I do so enjoy giving you choices." And here the fire rose in Harry Potter like a tide answering a moon, and it was not a small thing, and it whispered to him with his own voice, in the reasonable register he had learned to dread, "You could end him now. Not a star, just him. Just this one cruel ruined thing and the 14 who serve him, and the world is cleaner and your friends are safe, and no one in all of creation would say you were wrong. You have the right. After everything he has done to you, you have earned the right." And it was true. That was the horror that Jean had warned him of on the cliff over the gray sea. It was all true, every word. The cruelty was real, and the right was real, and the cleanness was real. And the only thing standing between Harry Potter and a perfectly justified incineration was a discipline he had been practicing for 11 days. He doubted himself. In the exact moment that doubt felt like weakness, like betrayal of the 2 people kneeling in the grass, Harry Potter doubted his own certainty, and the doubt held the fire 1 degree below the flood. "No," he said quietly to the voice, and then louder to Voldemort. "I'm not going to show you the power. You wouldn't survive it, and that's not me being dramatic. That's the actual physics of the situation. And I'm not going to let you hurt them." He took 1 step forward through the long grass, and he was not burning, and the not burning seemed to unsettle Voldemort more than any inferno could have. "Here's what's going to happen instead, Emma." And Emma Frost, who had been standing very still with her eyes half closed, said into the minds of all 14 Death Eaters at once, with a force that flattened them where they stood, "Sleep." They dropped, all of them, like marionettes with the strings cut, 14 bodies folding into the grass between one breath and the next, and Voldemort's head snapped around in disbelief. And in that instant of distraction, Jean's telekinesis closed around Ron and Hermione and drew them, bonds and gags dissolving, across the grass and behind the line of the 4. And Storm's wind rose white and screaming and threw the 2 Death Eaters flanking the door through the wall of the farmhouse. And it was over, the trap. The whole elaborate architecture of it, in the space of 3 seconds before Voldemort had finished turning his head. He stood alone in the doorway. He understood slowly, the way a man understands cold water, that every piece of his plan had been removed from the board not by overwhelming force, but by 4 people operating with the casual coordination of a thing that had practiced. And that the godling had not burned, had not raged, had simply efficiently with friends taken the whole of his leverage away. "You see," Harry said, "this is what you never understood. Not when I was 11, not now. You always thought power was the thing. The biggest wand, the most followers, the deepest fear. And you were facing, just now, more raw power than this planet has ever held. And it didn't even come up because the answer to you was never power. The answer to you was 4 people who trust each other. He walked toward the doorway unhurried, and the morning light did not gather at his edges because he was holding it down to the size of a man, and that more than any inferno was the most frightening thing the assembled wreckage of Lord Voldemort had ever seen. You wanted to grieve me into burning. You wanted to watch the savior become the monster. I understand the plan. It was a good plan, actually. It might even have worked a week ago before I had people in the room who knew to say my name. He stopped a few feet away. But you've made a mistake that I can't let you keep making. You keep coming back. The Horcruxes are gone, but you came back anyway, scraped yourself together out of ritual and spite, and you'll do it again and again because dying has never once taught you anything. So I'm going to do something about that. And I want you to understand that I'm not doing it in anger. That's important to me. I need you to know that I had every reason to burn you and I'm choosing not to. You cannot kill me, Voldemort said, and for the first time the high cold voice held something that was not contempt. I have made myself proof against death itself. You of all people know this, you cannot. I'm not going to kill you, Harry said. Killing you clearly doesn't work. I'm going to do the thing the fire is for the thing underneath the burning, the part nobody ever talks about because the burning is so loud. I'm going to unmake the ritual. And he reached out not with his hand, with the precise small drop of power Storm had taught him to hold, and he found the structure of the thing in front of him. The spell work and the spite and the borrowed flesh and the soul fragments coaxed back into a terrible coherence, the whole jury-rigged architecture by which a dead man had refused to stay dead, and Harry did not destroy it. He undid it. He found the knot that the ritual had tied in the fabric of mortality, the cheat, the loophole, the place where Tom Riddle had made himself an exception to the one rule that applies to everything, and with the surgeon's smallest possible touch, with a precision that cost him more than any flood would have, he untied it. Voldemort did not burn, he did not scream. He simply, between one moment and the next, became subject to death again, as everyone else is, as he had spent his whole life refusing to be. And the body that the ritual had been holding together against all natural law remembered, suddenly, that it had never truly been alive, and it sighed and it folded, and the thing that had been Lord Voldemort came apart into the dust it should have become years before, the soul fragments unknotting and dispersing on the morning air. Going at last where the dead go, which is through the door that Harry Potter had walked through once and come back from, and that Tom Riddle had spent his life too afraid to face. There was a silence in the green Devon morning. Huh, said Ron Weasley hoarsely from the grass. That's it, after all that, he just sort of stopped. That's it, Harry said. He was looking at the place where Voldemort had been and his face was doing something complicated, and Jean came and stood beside him close, not touching, and waited. He just sort of stopped. No prophecy, no duel, no monologue. I just untied the knot and let death have him back. He let out a long breath. It feels wrong, doesn't it? It feels like it should have been bigger. 11 years of my life and I ended it like fixing a leaky tap. It feels wrong, Jean agreed quietly, because you've been taught your whole life that the answer to a thing that big has to be a thing that big. Fire for fire, star for star. And the most dangerous lie the Phoenix ever tells is that the size of the answer should match the size of the rage. She put her hand against his back between the shoulder blades where the tension lived. You just proved you don't believe the lie. That's not a small thing, Harry. That's the whole thing. There remained the matter of 14 unconscious Death Eaters in the grass, which is precisely the kind of practical anticlimax that great confrontations never warn you about, and which the 4 of them now stood regarding with the collective expression of people who have won a battle and inherited the paperwork. I could erase them, Emma offered, examining a fingernail. Not kill them, merely edit. Take the master, the cause, the whole architecture of belief that made them kneel for that thing, and leave 14 confused men in a field with a powerful conviction that they ought to take up gardening. It's well within my range. I've done worse for less. She glanced sidelong at Harry. I mention it chiefly to watch you refuse because you're so reliably principled about it that it's become my favorite entertainment. You're not editing 14 minds, Emma. They're right on schedule. It's like a metronome. But there was no real argument in her, and Harry understood that the offer had been, in its sharp Emma way, a kind of test, a probe to see whether a man who had just unmade a Dark Lord would now reach for the convenient erasure, the small, tidy violation that no one would ever know about. He had felt the fire like the idea, too. He had told it no along with her. Bind them, Storm said, and the Ministry can collect them, and the Wisengamot can do whatever it is your people's courts do, and we will be a great many miles away and concerned with larger skies by the time anyone thinks to ask us questions. She looked at Harry. You ended their master without spectacle. They will not believe it. They will invent a version where you struck him down in fire and thunder, because the small, true thing is unbearable to people who needed the Dark Lord to be defeated by something as large as their fear of him. Let them. The legend will protect your privacy better than any ward. Ron Weasley, rubbing the circulation back into his wrists, looked from the dispersing dust where Voldemort had been to his oldest friend and back again and shook his head slowly. Mate, he said, I have watched you do some mental things. The basilisk, the dragon, the whole the dying and coming back, but I think watching you beat who by being calm might actually be the strangest. You didn't even raise your voice. That was the point, Harry said. He spent 20 years trying to make me as frightened and as loud as he was. Calm was the only thing left that he couldn't survive. He crouched and began, with ordinary conjured ropes and no fire at all, to bind the nearest sleeping Death Eater, because there was something in the smallness of the task that he needed, the human ordinariness of tying a knot with his hands after the thing he had just done with his will. Hermione crouched beside him and helped, and for a moment the two of them worked in the companionable silence of people who had been tidying up after disasters together since they were 12, and it was, Harry thought, possibly the most normal he had felt since the night the sky leaned down and chose him. They got Ron and Hermione home to the burrow, where Molly Weasley wept and shouted and fed everyone in roughly equal measure, and where Hermione, once she had her voice back and a cup of tea in her hands, fixed Harry with the particular look she had been deploying since they were 11, the look that meant she had already worked out something he had not yet said. You didn't burn him, she said. They were in the garden, the two of them, while the others gave them the privacy of old friends. I felt it building. We both did, kneeling there. I felt the air go hot and I thought, that's it, he's going to do it, he's going to let it out, and I was, Harry, I was glad. God forgive me, kneeling in the grass with that thing's hand on me, I was glad you were about to burn him, and then you didn't, you went small instead. How? I had help, Harry said. He glanced toward the house, where through the window 3 women who could each level a city were submitting with varying grace to Molly Weasley's insistence that they eat. 3 people who came to remind me what I am when the fire tries to tell me I'm something else. I couldn't do it alone, Hermione. That's the part I've made my peace with. I'm not strong enough to hold this thing alone. Nobody is. The ones who tried, the ones who had no one in the room, that's how you get a dead star. Hermione was quiet for a moment, watching him, and then she said the thing she had clearly been working her way toward, because Hermione Granger had never in her life left a dangerous question unasked. The 3 of them, they're not just your handlers, are they? The way they look at you, the way you look at them. She did not say it unkindly. She had never been able to leave a true thing unspoken merely because it was delicate. Are you sure that's safe, given what you said? About not being able to tell where the fire's feelings end and yours begin. And Harry, who had been asking himself exactly that question in the dark of every night since Jean had first warned him of it on the cliff over the Grey Sea, gave his oldest friend the honest answer because she had earned it and because saying it aloud was a way of testing whether it was true. No, he said, I'm not sure it's safe. I'm sure it's real, and I'm sure it's mine, and I'm sure I've never once let the fire put a feeling in any of them that they didn't choose for themselves, because that's the one line I will die before I cross. But safe, he smiled, and it was tired, and it was true. Nothing about my life has ever been safe, Hermione. I've stopped using that as the measure. The measure now is whether it's honest, and it is. Hermione looked at him for a long moment, the friend who had followed him into every disaster since they were children, and then she nodded once and reached over and took his hand. And they sat in Molly Weasley's garden in the ordinary English afternoon while inside the house an Alien Empire's 3-day deadline ticked quietly toward its end, and for a little while neither of them spoke, because some things do not need it. The wizarding world learned of Voldemort's second and final death by the following morning, and proceeded, exactly as Storm had predicted, to get the whole thing magnificently wrong. By the time the prophet went to press, the quiet untying of a ritual knot in a Devon field had become a duel of titans across a burning sky. There were eyewitnesses, all of whom had been unconscious. There were photographs, all of which had been taken afterward of an empty field and improved upon by an editor with a sense of drama and a deadline. The official account had Harry Potter calling down a column of celestial fire that consumed the Dark Lord and 17 of his followers in a pillar of light visible from 3 counties. The rather more lurid account in a competing publication had him growing wings. The narrator reports all this with affection, because there is something deeply, reassuringly human in the way a frightened people will always prefer the legend to the truth, will always need their monsters slain by something monstrous. Because to be told that the great terror of the age was undone by a calm man tying off a knot is to be told that the terror had been smaller all along than the fear of it, and almost no one can bear to hear that. So Harry Potter became, overnight and against his every wish, a god in fact as well as in power, and he read the prophet over his breakfast on the cliff and put it down and said, "Well, that's unhelpful," and Emma laughed for a full minute. But the legend was a luxury they could not afford to enjoy for long, because the real sky, the one above the weather, had filled with ships. They could all feel it by the second morning, each in their own register. Harry felt it as a coldness pressing on the edge of his perception, a vast impatient and growing weight in the high dark. Storm felt it in the upper air, the ionosphere singing with the wrongness of 100 drives that did not belong to this world. Jean felt it as the phoenix in Harry felt it, a recognition, an old enmity stirring, the bird empire and the bird fire turning toward one another across a gulf of years and grievance. And Emma felt it the only way Emma ever felt anything truly large, as a problem to be solved, and she had spent the night solving it, sitting up alone with a map of the orbital approaches she had pulled from a satellite network she was not supposed to have access to and had accessed anyway. "They're not attacking," she reported when the four of them gathered in the morning and Charles Xavier joined them, his presence settling into the room from across an ocean by way of cerebro, a warmth and a gravity that made the cottage feel briefly like a war room. "That's the part I cannot make sense of. They have the firepower to sterilize this planet from where they sit." Gladiator said 3 days, and the 3 days are nearly up and the fleet is in position and they are simply waiting. Empires do not wait. Waiting is expensive. Waiting means someone up there is having an argument. "They are having an argument," Charles agreed, his mental voice grave. "I have brushed the edges of it. The Shi'ar command is not united." Gladiator filed his report, and his report did not say what his orders required it to say. It did not say the host is corrupt, destroy the world. It said the host resists the fire and is held by allies who reinforce the resistance, and I recommend observation before action. He defied his throne, Harry. Quietly in the language of a soldier, but he defied it. He bought you time. The question is what you do with it. "What are the options?" Harry asked. "We could run," Charles said, with the honesty Harry had come to value in him. "You could take the four of you and anyone else you love and fold yourselves into a corner of space the Empire would need centuries to find. The fire would let you. It is good at hiding when it wishes to. But you would be running forever, and the Empire would burn this world anyway, to be sure." The moment they concluded the host had fled, he let that sit. "We could fight, which against the full Imperial Guard and a fleet is a war we would probably lose, and which would prove to the Empire precisely the thing it already believes, that the Phoenix brings ruin wherever it lands. Or, Harry said, I do the thing I told Gladiator I'd do. I have the more interesting conversation with the Empress." "You would have to go to them," Charles said, "to the throne world. Into the heart of the Empire that put Jean on trial and condemned her, and stand in front of a court that has spent 1,000 years certain that the only good Phoenix is a dead one, and convince them, with the fire banked inside you the entire time, screaming to defend itself, that they are wrong." He paused, and the warmth in his mental voice deepened into something almost paternal. "It is the most dangerous thing you could possibly do. It is also, I suspect, the only thing that ends with this world intact and you still yourself. I have spent my life believing that the answer to fear is not force, but the patient, maddening, often fatal work of changing a mind. I will not pretend it usually works. I will only tell you that it is the work I believe in, and that if anyone alive can stand in front of an empire and make it doubt its oldest certainty, it is a man who has spent 2 weeks making the most powerful force in the universe doubt its own." The cottage was quiet. The sea worked away at the cliff below. Jean had gone very still, and Harry knew why. He could feel it, the memory rising in her, the court, the guard, the Empress, the trial that had ended with her choosing to die. To go back into that was to ask her to walk back into the worst day of her several lives. "You don't have to come," he said to her quietly. Jean Grey looked at him, and then she laughed, short and disbelieving and entirely without humor, and said, "Harry, you are proposing to fly into the throne world of the Empire that murdered me, to argue the Phoenix's case in front of the same court with the fire that destroyed me banked inside you the whole time, and you think I'm going to stay home?" She stood and crossed to him, and the gold flickered in her eyes. "I was the prosecution's only evidence last time, the proof that the fire takes its hosts. Let me be the defense this time. Let me stand in that court and tell them what I watched you do in a Devon field. There is no one else in the universe whose testimony they cannot dismiss. They have to believe me. I'm the one they were right about." Her voice did not break, but it bent. "Let me turn the worst thing that ever happened to me into the thing that saves your world. I have wanted for 10 years to make it mean something. Don't you dare take that from me." "We're all going," Storm said with the finality of weather. "An empire respects a delegation far more than it respects a supplicant." We arrive as what we are, the people who hold the line the phoenix cannot cross. Let them see that the host does not stand alone. Let them see the line. And I, said Emma, rising white and lethal, and beneath it the narrator notes, frightened in the specific way of a woman who has decided to do a brave thing anyway. We'll be reading every mind in that court and feeding you, Harry, in real time, exactly which of those certain alien faces is beginning to waver so that you know where to push. I am, after all, decorative and devastating. She lifted her chin. Mostly devastating. Charles, darling, tell the children we may be late. Try not to die, Charles said, which from him was an entire benediction, and withdrew, and the warmth of him left the cottage, and the four of them stood in the sudden ordinary quiet with an empire overhead, and a journey before them that would, one way or another, end the story. He spent the last evening before the journey doing the thing he always did before walking into something that might kill him. He negotiated. Not with the women. That conversation was finished and had ended, to his ongoing astonishment, with three people who could level cities choosing freely to walk into an empire at his side. He negotiated with the fire. He sat alone on the cliff with the ship-filled sky overhead, and he addressed the entity directly in the wordless place where they spoke, and he laid down terms with the cold, clear precision that had carried him through every horror of his life. You are going to want to defend yourself, he told it, in front of that court. When they call you a destroyer of worlds, you are going to want to show them why they should be afraid, because being feared is the closest thing to being understood that you have ever been offered, and you are lonely, and a lonely thing will take fear if love is not on the menu. I understand that. I am not going to ask you to be silent. He felt the entity attend to him, vast and patient, and he had learned to recognize genuinely listening. But here is the rule for the throne world, and it is the most important rule we have made. If at any moment I'm standing in that court and I become certain that they will never listen, certain that the only language they understand is force, certain that I have the right to make them afraid because they have given me no other choice, that is the moment you do not get. That is the moment I will doubt hardest, precisely because it will feel least like a choice. You will whisper that I have no option. You always do. And I am telling you now while I am calm, so that the calm version of me can bind the frightened one. There is always a third option. There is always the thing nobody in the room wants you to think of. We are going to find it, you and I, in front of an empire with 1 billion lives on the table, and we are going to find it small. The fire was quiet for a long moment. And then it pressed against him an image, gently, and offering not the woman at the rail of the ship this time, but something older still. A memory of the first time it had ever unmade a world, eons before the woman, before any of the hosts, when it had been young as cosmic things go and had not yet learned to grieve. It showed him the world it had burned, and then it showed him slowly the world that had grown in the ash, green and teeming and entire, a world that existed only because the first one had ended. And Harry understood what the entity was telling him, which was, I have always believed the burning was the point. You are trying to teach me that the burning was only ever the cost. I do not know yet if I believe you. But I am willing, for the first time in my long life, to go into a room full of people who hate me, and find out whether you are right. Thank you, Harry said, and meant it, and the strange, tender weight of being thanked by nothing, of having a god accept a man's terms, sat in him like a coal as he watched the sea. He was still there when Emma found him. She did not announce herself. She sat down beside him on the cold grass, white silk and all, with the unconcern of a woman who had decided the universe could accommodate her wherever she chose to be, and for a while she said nothing, which from Emma Frost was a gift of enormous and deliberate generosity. Then she said, looking out at the water and not at him, I am afraid. I want you to know that, because I will deny it in front of the others, and because you of all people deserve to be told a true thing before we do something this stupid. Her voice was very even. I have spent my whole life making certain that no one could ever have power over me. It is the organizing principle of my existence. Read them first, know them first, never be the one who can be surprised. And I am about to fly into an alien court at the side of a man whose mind I cannot read, to defend a force that frightens me more than anything I have ever encountered, for no better reason than that he refuses to use it on me. She turned to him at last, and the cut glass was gone, and what remained was startlingly young. Do you understand how unprecedented this is for me? I am choosing to be vulnerable, on purpose. It's appalling. I blame you entirely. You could stay, Harry said quietly. I could, Emma agreed. And I am not going to, and we both know why, and I am not going to say it on a clifftop like a woman in a film, so don't look at me like that. But she did not move away, and after a moment she leaned fractionally until her shoulder rested against his, a contact so small and so deliberate that it carried more weight than any speech. And the fire in Harry strained toward her with its ancient eagerness to make her sure, to fold her doubt away, to give her the certainty she had organized her whole life around not having. and Harry held it still and gave her instead the one thing she had never been given by anyone in her long armored life, which was the room to be uncertain and stay anyway. For the record, Emma said after a while to the dark water, this is also the most attractive thing anyone has ever refused to do to me. You're making rather a habit of it. And Harry laughed, and she almost did, and overhead the Empire's ships wheeled silent against the stars, and the last evening burned down quietly toward a morning that would take them up into the dark. That night, back on the cliff, with Voldemort dust and the Empire a day and a half away, Harry could not sleep, and he was not the only one. He found Jean on the cliff in the dark, where the impossible flowers had closed their faces against the night and the sea threw itself endlessly at the rocks below, and he came and stood beside her, and for a while they watched the black water together without speaking. You held, she said at last, today, with your friend's blood about to be on his hands. I have replayed my own version of that moment 1,000 times, the moment I reached for everything, and I have never once been able to imagine choosing differently, and I watched you choose differently in real time with more reason than I ever had. She turned to him in the dark, and the starlight caught the gold that came and went in her eyes. Do you know what that did to me? To watch the thing that destroyed me be survivable in someone else's hands. You gave me something today, Harry. You gave me back a version of myself where it wasn't inevitable, where I wasn't doomed, where I just didn't have anyone in the room. You have someone in the room now, Harry said. I do. She was very close. The fire in him strained toward her, the old ancient devotion of the entity tangled inseparably with his own entirely human regard for this brave and grieving brilliant woman. And he held it gently, the way Storm had taught him, not refusing it but choosing its size, so that what reached her was not a flood but exactly and only what he meant. A man choosing with his own heart the woman in front of him. Tell me this is yours, she said softly. Not its. I need to hear you say you know the difference. Because I have spent 10 years afraid that I'd never be able to be close to that fire again without it being the fire that wanted me. And I need to know from you that you can tell. I can tell, Harry said. It loves you like a memory, like the woman at the rail of the ship, like something it lost and is trying to get back, and I feel that every time you're near, the whole grief of it, and it's real and it's not mine. He lifted his hand and did not touch her yet and let her see that he was choosing not to until she chose first. But this. The way you argue with me over the electricity bill and burn the toast on purpose because you know it annoys Emma, and the fact that you crossed an ocean for a stranger because you couldn't stand the idea of someone facing the fire alone the way you had to, that's not a memory. That's you, and what I feel about that is mine. I'd stake my soul on the difference. I've had a lot of practice telling whose feelings are in my head. Jean Grey closed the last of the distance between them, and the narrator, who has promised you a great many things and intends to keep his promises, will draw the curtain here with the discretion the moment deserves, and tell you only what matters. That she chose him freely with her own mind and her own grief and her own brave, battered heart, and that the fire for once was quiet, banked down small and watching, allowed to be present but not to drive, present at the loving the way a guest is present at a wedding. And that on a dark cliff over a roaring sea, two people who had each held the loneliest fire in the universe were, for a little while, not lonely. And high above, far out in the dark, the lights of an empire's fleet resolved at last into the patient geometry of a war, sliding into orbit around a small blue world, and the 3 days were nearly spent, and the lesser darkness was finished, and the greater one was about to begin. But that, dear reader, is the next chapter, and the considerate narrator does not begrudge two tired people a single night of peace before the sky catches fire. They had earned it. They were about to pay for it. Let them have the night, Chapter 4 and Chapter 5, The Throne of Ash. They did not take a ship because Harry did not need one, and the entity, when consulted on the matter of crossing the unthinkable gulf between a small blue world and the throne of a bird empire, had been so delighted to be asked that it had nearly carried him off his feet. He folded the distance. That is the only honest way to describe a thing that physics would prefer you did not describe at all. He stood on the cliff with the 3 women joined to him, Jean's hand in his, Storm's on his shoulder, Emma's fingers light at the back of his neck where her telepathy could ride his perception like a passenger in a fast car, and he reached out across the dark to the bright hostile point that was the Shi'ar throne world, and he decided that the space between here and there was a convenience rather than a law, and then there was no space, and then they were there. The narrator will not pretend this was comfortable. To cross a galaxy in a single act of will is to be, very briefly, the size of the galaxy, and 3 human minds and one extraordinary one rode that largeness for a heartbeat that contained nebulae, and came out the other side gasping, reassembled, intact, standing on a landing platform of white metal under a sky the color of a struck bronze bell. with the most beautiful and most terrible city any of them had ever seen spread out below in tiers of light that went down and down past the curve of the world. "Show off," said Emma faintly with her hand pressed to her sternum, but she was looking at the city with the avarice of a woman who collected magnificent things, and even she had nothing sharp to say about it. They had been expected. Of course they had been expected. An act of will that crossed a galaxy did not go unnoticed by an empire that had built its entire theology around watching for exactly that. Imperial guards stood arrayed across the platform in their hundreds, a wall of beings each of whom could have been the climax of a lesser story, and at their head stood Gladiator. And when his eyes found Harry, there was in them a flicker of something that the narrator, who has been watching this blue executioner carefully, is prepared to call hope hastily suppressed. "You came," Gladiator said. "You said make you wrong," Harry answered. "I can't do that from a cliff in Cornwall, so here I am in your house, with the fire banked and my hands empty." He spread them to show the emptiness, and the gesture rippled through the assembled guard like wind through wheat, because there is nothing in the universe so unnerving to a soldier as an enemy who arrives unarmed and unafraid. "Take me to your Empress. I believe she and I have a conversation to have about the difference between a thing that can destroy everything and a thing that will." They were escorted, not marched, which Harry noted as a courtesy. Gladiator had no orders to extend and had extended anyway, through the singing white heart of the Empire toward the throne, and the walk took the better part of an hour, and the narrator intends to dwell on it, because the style anchor for this whole account demands that we luxuriate in grand and surreal and cosmic sensation, and the corridors of the Shi'ar throne world are nothing if not an invitation to luxuriate. They walked through a hall where the entire history of the Empire's conquests had been rendered as weather, storms of captured light that broke and reformed against the high ceiling, each squall a subjugated world, so that to cross the room was to walk beneath 1,000 silent thunderstorms of other people's defeats. They walked across a bridge of nothing, a span of pure transparency over a shaft that went down past the curve of the planet into a core of bottled starlight, and Storm, who had spent her life intimate with high places and falling, looked down into it and went very quiet, and Harry felt her hand find his sleeve, not for balance but for the human comfort of contact, and he understood that even a goddess of the sky can be made small by an empire that keeps a star in its basement. They walked past galleries where the Shi'ar nobility watched them come, 10,000 alien faces in 100 alien shapes, beautiful and terrible and certain, the inheritors of a galaxy come to watch the monster walk to its judgment. "They're not afraid of you," Emma murmured, reading the galleries as they passed, her professional curiosity briefly outpacing her dread. "That's the strange thing. I expected fear. There's almost none. They're Harry, they're grieving in advance. They've been taught their whole lives that the Phoenix is the great sorrow of the universe, and they look at you and they don't see a threat, they see a funeral. Yours and possibly theirs. It's the saddest crowd I've ever stood in front of, and I once gave a eulogy to the Hellfire Club." "That tracks," Harry said. "Deathbird needs them grieving. A grieving people will let you do terrible things to keep the grief from getting worse. Fear makes people fight, grief makes them comply." He looked up at the watching galleries, at the 10,000 mournful certain faces, and something in him that was entirely himself, and not at all the fire, hardened into a quiet resolve. "I'd like to give them something other than a funeral, just once. I don't think anyone's tried." Gladiator, walking ahead, did not turn, but his great shoulders shifted, and when he spoke his voice was pitched low for them alone. "I have served this throne for 1,000 years, he said. "I have carried out 41 executions of beings the Imperium deemed too dangerous to live. I believed in all but one of them." A pause, the white corridor sang faintly around them. "I am telling you this so that you understand the weight of what I am about to do, which is nothing. I am ordered to stand at the Empress's side and signal the guard when the verdict comes. I will stand there, I will not signal. It is the smallest treason a soldier can commit, the treason of stillness, and it may cost me everything, and it is all I have to give you. Use the time it buys, do not waste it being eloquent. The Shi'ar have heard eloquence. Show them the thing words cannot fake." He glanced back once, his ancient eyes finding Harry's. "Show them a host who will not burn even when burning is just." They were made to wait before the doors of the great hall in an antechamber of the same singing metal, and waiting is its own kind of weapon in the arsenals of empires, and the Shi'ar deployed it expertly. The doors were 3 times the height of a man and carved with the Empire's victories, and they did not open, and the 4 of them stood before them in a silence that the throne intended to be unbearable. Jean Grey had gone the color of ash. Harry felt it before he saw it, the change in her, the way the air around her thinned with the effort of her control, and he understood that he had asked something of her that he had not fully reckoned the cost of, because the room beyond those doors was the room where she had been sentenced to die. And the smell of the metal and the song of the walls and the particular quality of the light were all, to her body, the sensory furniture of the worst hours of her several lives. She was not afraid of the verdict. She was afraid of the room. There is a difference, and only those who have survived a place know it. I can do this without you, Harry said low for her alone. You can wait here. Your testimony's already in my head. Emma can feed it to them through me. You don't have to walk back into that room, Jean. You've already paid for this once. No, Jean said. Her voice was steady, her hands were not, and she let him see them because they had agreed long ago on a cliff to be people who did not pretend. If I wait out here, then they win the oldest argument they ever made me believe, which is that the room is bigger than I am. I let it be bigger than me for 10 years. I am not doing it again. I am going to walk into the place where I died on my own feet, and I am going to use the worst thing that ever happened to me to save your world, and then the room is going to be just a room, and I am going to be free of it. The gold flickered in her eyes, steadied. Stand next to me when the doors open. That's all I need, not your power. Just don't be on the other side of the room when I walk in. I won't leave your side, Harry said, and meant it as a promise about a doorway, and would discover, within the hour, that the universe intended to test it as a promise about something far larger. Storm laid her hand against Jean's back between the shoulder blades, the same place Jean had touched Harry in a Devon garden, the gesture passing between them like a current. Emma, who did not touch people unnecessarily and was making an exception she would later deny, took Jean's trembling hand in her own and held it, white glove around cold fingers, and said, with the brisk tenderness she used as a shield, "If anyone in that room so much as thinks an unkind thing about you, darling, I will make them believe they have always wanted to take up competitive flower arranging. I have done it before. It is humiliating and permanent. Lean on that if you need something to lean on." And Jean laughed, a small, broken, grateful sound, and the great doors, sensing perhaps that their moment of maximum cruelty had passed, chose that instant to open. The throne world of the Shi'ar is a thing that beggars the human vocabulary, and the narrator, who has a great fondness for the human vocabulary and its game attempts at the impossible, will make only a brief attempt before admitting defeat. Imagine a palace the size of a continent, grown rather than built, of a white living metal that sang very faintly when the light moved across it. Imagine corridors that opened onto vistas of 100 conquered worlds rendered in light. A galaxy's worth of subjugation organized into something that an aesthete would call beautiful and an honest person would call a wound. Imagine, at the heart of it, a throne room with a ceiling so high that clouds had formed in it, a private weather of power, and beneath that indoor sky a court of 1,000 of the Empire's greatest, ranged in tiers around a central floor of black glass, and upon a dais of that same singing metal, a throne, and upon the throne the majestrix of the Shi'ar Imperium. She was not Lilandra. The narrator mentions this because some of you, versed in the histories, will have hoped for Lilandra, who loved an Earthman once and might have been merciful. But Lilandra had been deposed in one of the Empire's periodic convulsions, and the woman on the throne now had come to power on a single promise, which was that she would finish what the Empire had always been too sentimental to finish, and that promise had a name, and the name was the Phoenix. Her name was Deathbird, and she had wings, and she had talons, and she had the particular bottomless certainty of a ruler who has staked her entire legitimacy on the destruction of one specific enemy and therefore cannot afford, will not survive, the discovery that the enemy might be reasoned with. Mark her well, reader. She is the most dangerous kind of antagonist there is, not evil exactly, but trapped. She needed Harry Potter to be a monster, because if he was not a monster, then her throne was built on a lie, and a ruler defending a lie will burn a galaxy before she will admit the floor beneath her is air. The host of the Phoenix, Deathbird said, and her voice filled the vast room without effort, stands in the heart of the Imperium, having crossed a galaxy with a thought, having flaunted before my guard the very power that has ended realities, and asks for conversation. She leaned forward on the throne, and her wings shifted, and the court held its breath. There will be no conversation. There will be a judgment as there was before, and this time there will be no resurrection to cheat it. You have walked into the one place in all of creation built specifically to kill the thing you carry. I confess I did not expect you to make it so easy. Before Harry could answer, Storm stepped forward, and the court, which had been prepared to ignore the host's companions as one ignores a condemned man's effects, found that it could not ignore her, because Auror Munro had spent a lifetime learning how to enter a room full of people who outranked her and make them forget that they did. Majestrix, she said, and her voice did not rise, and yet it filled the vast hall as completely as Deathbird's had, because some authority does not need volume. I am Auror Munro. On my own world I have been called a goddess, and I have ruled, and I have walked away from ruling, which is the rarer accomplishment. I mention this not to claim standing in your court, but so that you understand I know the weight of a throne, and the particular fear of a ruler who has staked everything on a single promise. She let her pale eyes rest on Deathbird, and there was no challenge in them, which was somehow worse than challenge. We have not come as supplicants, and we have not come as conquerors. We have come as witnesses and as the proof of a thing your histories have never recorded, that a host of the fire can stand in a delegation of those who love him and remain himself. Look at us, Majestrix. 4 beings who could, between us, do this court considerable harm, standing on your black glass with our hands open. If the Phoenix were the simple destroyer your throne requires it to be, we would not be standing. We would be a crater. The fire would have used the host to remove the threat the instant we arrived. It has not. Ask yourself why. Ask yourself what it costs the Empire's oldest certainty that we are still alive and still speaking. A murmur moved through the tiers. Deathbird's wings shifted, a small, involuntary betrayal, the flinch of a ruler who has felt a question she cannot afford lodge in her court like an arrow. You stand because I permit it, Deathbird said. We stand, Storm answered with the serene finality of weather closing over a coast, because the thing you fear chooses, every second, not to make us kneel. That is not permission, Majestrix, that is mercy. And an empire that cannot tell the difference between the two has perhaps forgotten what it is afraid of. She inclined her head, regal and unhurried, and stepped back to Harry's side, having done in 90 seconds what armies could not, which was to make a court of 1,000 begin, quietly, to doubt their empress, and Harry, who had been about to be clever, found that she had bought him a better silence than cleverness ever could, and used it. I notice, Harry said into the enormous silence, that you've already decided the verdict, which makes this a sentencing, not a trial. That's fine, I've been to a few of those. He looked up at her, small and human and entirely calm in the center of the black glass floor with 1,000 of the galaxy's mighty ranged around him. And the calm was again the most frightening thing he could have offered, because the court had come to watch a monster rage, and instead found a man being patient with their empress. But before you sentence me, you're going to let one person testify, not me, her. He did not look at Jean, he did not have to. You know who she is, you all know who she is. She's the only host of the Phoenix you ever managed to put on trial and convict. She's your proof. She's the whole reason you're certain. So before you kill the next one, you're going to let your star witness speak. Or are you afraid of what your own evidence might say? It was a good move. The narrator admires a good move. Deathbird could not refuse without admitting that she feared her own proof, and an empress who fears her own proof has already lost the court. And so Deathbird, trapped by the very certainty she had built her throne upon, inclined her head, and the floor of black glass turned, and Jean Grey stepped forward into the place where she had once been condemned to die. She was magnificent. The narrator has been waiting 4 chapters to use that word about Jean Grey without the irony that has shadowed it, and uses it now without reservation. She walked to the center of the court that had murdered her, the court whose verdict she had once agreed with, the court that had been in the most terrible sense right about her, and she did not shake, and she did not weep, and she lifted her chin and addressed an empire. You all know what I did, she said. You were here, or your parents were, or you've read it in the histories you keep. I held the Phoenix, and the Phoenix held me, and I lost the seam between us, and I ate a star, and 1 billion souls aboard a world I will never be able to name went into that fire because I could no longer tell where I ended and it began. You were right to condemn me. I want to say that plainly in this room where I said it once before. You were right. The Phoenix took me, and through me it killed, and the galaxy was not safe while I drew breath. She let the silence hold. And that is exactly why my testimony matters, because I am the one host you can point to and say, that is what happens, I am the proof. So when I tell you that the proof has changed, you cannot dismiss me as naive or corrupted or in love. You convicted me, you have to believe me when I tell you that this one is different. Hosts always seem different, Deathbird said, to those who love them. I don't love him, Jean said, which was a lie, and the narrator notes that it was a lie told for a true purpose, which is the most forgivable kind. I came because I am the only person alive who knows what it feels like from the inside, and because I watched him do something I could not do. I watched him hold the fire down to a single drop in the exact moment his oldest friends were about to die in front of him, when every reason in the universe told him to burn. I lost myself to far less than that. He held, not because he is stronger than I was, because he doubts, because he has built his entire relationship with the fire on the refusal to ever be certain he has the right. And the corruption, Majestrix, as you well know from 1,000 years of watching it, the corruption is certainty. It cannot take a host who will not stop asking whether he should. She turned slowly to address the tears of the court directly, the 1,000 certain faces. You have spent 1,000 years afraid of the fire. You were not wrong to be. But you have never once in all that time asked whether the fire could be taught. You only ever asked how to kill it. And here finally is a host who is teaching it, and you want to extinguish him before you find out if it's working, because the one thing your empire cannot survive is the discovery that the answer was never extermination. It was patience. It was exactly the thing you were too frightened to try. A voice rose from the left-hand tiers, where the empire's scholars sat in their gray, and the whole court turned, because scholars did not speak in the throne room uninvited, and the breaking of the protocol was itself an event. An old Shi'ar, feathered and stooped, got to his feet with the deliberateness of the very aged and the very unafraid. Majestrix, the scholar said, with respect to your throne and your purpose, I have spent 90 years of my life studying the histories of the fire, and I must tell this court a thing it has never been permitted to hear, because the throne has always silenced it. He turned to the court, not the Empress, which was its own quiet treason. We have records of 43 hosts across the span of the Imperium's memory. The throne teaches that all 43 were destroyed by the fire, and that this proves the fire's nature. It does not. I have read the records. Of the 43, 31 were attacked by us within days of bonding, provoked, harvested, driven to manifestation by our own hand because we were too frightened to wait. We have never once in the entire history of our terror simply observed a host left in peace. We do not have evidence that the fire destroys its hosts. We have evidence that we destroy them first and call the burning proof. His old voice did not waver. This one came to us in peace. This one we have not yet provoked. I am an old man, Majestrix, and I will likely not survive saying this, but I have waited 90 years to see a host we did not kill before we understood, and I would beg this court, for the sake of the truth we claim to serve, to let me see it before I die. The court erupted. The narrator will spare you the cacophony of 1,000 alien voices discovering, all at once, that the thing they had grieved for might have been a thing they had been doing, and will note only that Deathbird, upon her throne, had gone the particular stillness of a ruler who feels the floor turning to air beneath her. The host, Harry said into the uproar, and he pitched it to carry, and it carried, because the fire lent his voice exactly as much weight as he permitted and not 1 degree more, would like to say something, not eloquent, I was warned off eloquent. A few of the watching faces against everything flickered with something near amusement, and Harry filed the flicker away as a foothold. You've all been told I'm a funeral. I felt it walking in here. 10,000 people grieving me before I've done anything, because that's what you've been taught the fire is, a sorrow that arrives and takes and leaves a hole. And I'm not going to stand here and tell you the fire is safe, because it isn't, and you'd be fools to believe me, and you're not fools. The fire wants to burn this room right now. It's wanted to since I walked in. It's making me an extremely good argument as we speak about how much cleaner the galaxy would be without the Empire that spent 1,000 years killing my kind in their cradles. He let that land, let them feel the truth of the threat, because a lie would have lost them. Here's the only thing I've got that isn't eloquent. I'm not doing it. I'm standing in the one room in creation built to make me, and I'm choosing every single second not to. You want to know if the fire can be held? You're watching me hold it. This is what it looks like. It doesn't look like safety. It looks like a man saying no over and over while the most reasonable voice in the universe tells him yes. That's all mastery ever is. It's not the absence of the monster. It's the refusal renewed every second for as long as you live. Emma's voice came into his mind, threaded with something he had never heard from her before, something close to awe. You're winning them. Harry, you're actually winning them. The scholars are openly weeping. The military caste has stopped looking at Deathbird and started looking at you. Even the guard, half the guard has shifted their weight off their striking foot. 3 more minutes and the room is yours. And then sharp, the awe curdling to alarm, which is exactly why she can't give you 3 minutes. She's moving. Harry, she's reaching for something old, something in the throne itself. I can feel the shape of it in its, oh number. It's the thing they used on Jean. It's the harvester, Jean said aloud from the center of the floor, and the word came out of her with the flat, cold recognition of a woman hearing the name of the thing that murdered her. She turned to Harry, and there was no fear in her face, only a terrible urgency. Harry, whatever it does to me, whatever you see it do to me, hold. Do you understand? It's going to make you certain. That's all it does. It manufactures the one thing the fire needs. Don't believe the certainty. It isn't yours. It's the machine's. Promise me you'll. She did not finish because Deathbird, upon her throne, with her court turning against her and her 1,000-year lie dissolving in real time, did the only thing a trapped ruler can do, and reached into the singing metal of the throne and woke the harvester, and the holy terrible engine of the Shi'ar descended from the high galleries on a column of grinding light. It was an old thing and a holy thing in the dark theology of the Shi'ar. The harvester, they called it, a siege engine of the soul, built in the Empire's most desperate hour for the single purpose of provoking a phoenix host into manifestation, so that the guard might strike at the fire while it was distracted by rage. It had been used exactly once before on Jean, and it was the reason her trial had ended as it had. It worked by pain. It worked by reaching into the host and into everyone the host loved and squeezing all at once, a synchronized agony designed to bypass every discipline, every rule, every careful refusal, and to present the fire with the one thing it could never resist. A host in extremis, a host whose grief had become so total that certainty felt like the only mercy left. It fired. And Harry Potter felt the three women he had crossed a galaxy beside cry out as one. Felt Jean buckle in the center of the court with the old remembered agony of the thing that had broken her once already. Felt Storm's serene control shatter as the device drove spikes of pure pain into the place where her power lived. Felt Emma's diamond mind, her armored unbreakable mind, crack like ice under a boot. And he felt his own body fill with a fire that was no longer asking permission. The fire did not whisper this time, the fire roared. They are hurting them, it said in his own voice, in the voice of every righteous rage he had ever swallowed. They are hurting the women you love in front of you on purpose to provoke you. And you have the power to end it, to end all of it, to unmake this device and this throne and this empire and the 1,000 years of fear that built it, and no one in all of creation would say you were wrong. They proved it. They chose this. You came in peace and they answered with the harvester. There is no third option now. There was never going to be a third option. You were a fool to believe in one. Burn. And Harry Potter, for the second time in his life, was certain. He had been certain once before in a cottage on a cliff for a single second, and Jean had said his name and he had remembered the blue stone. But Jean was on her knees now, screaming, with a sheer soul engine grinding the worst day of her several lives back into her bones. And she could not say his name, and Storm could not steady him, and Emma could not feed him the room, because all three of the women whose job it was to remind him what he was when the fire lied were, by exquisite and deliberate design, unable to speak. The harvester had been built by people who understood the phoenix very well. It had been built to remove, in a single stroke, exactly the thing that held a host human, not their power but the voices of the ones who loved them. Deathbird had not needed to make Harry weak. She had only needed to make him alone. The three women fought it. The narrator wants this on the record before the dark part, because what they did in those moments was the bravest thing in this entire account, and it is going to look, from the outside, like failure. Jean Grey, on her knees in the center of the court with the harvester grinding the memory of her own death back into her marrow. The star, the billion souls, the unmaking. All of it played back through her at once with the surgical cruelty of a machine built for exactly this purpose. Reached for Harry's mind with the last of her telepathy, and found the connection scrambled, drowned, the channel between them flooded with manufactured agony, and she screamed his name into a link that could no longer carry it. Storm, driven to the floor beside her, the serene queen of the sky reduced to a body in pain, fought to call the weather, to break the engine with a bolt from the indoor storm overhead, and found that the harvester had anticipated her, that her own power had been turned into another channel for the grinding, so that every attempt to summon the lightning fed her more pain. And Emma Frost, whose diamond mind was the strongest psychic armor on her world, felt the engine crack it like an egg and reached, even as it broke her, for Harry, for the locked door she had spent weeks unable to open, and threw herself against it not to get in but to scream through it the only word that mattered, and the word did not land because the door was no longer answering anyone, not even her, not even now. They had been removed from the equation precisely as designed. And this is the thing the Shi'ar engineers had understood and Deathbird had counted on. That a host does not fall because he is weak, but because he is alone, and that the surest way to make the strongest man in the universe alone is to fill the room with the screams of everyone he loves and then take away their voices. Inside the inferno, the small calm part of Harry that was still entirely himself watched the certainty arrive like a tide, and understood with horrible clarity that it was winning. It did not feel like being taken. That was the lie of it, the deepest lie, the one Jean had tried to warn him of on a cliff over a gray sea a lifetime ago. It felt like waking up. It felt like every doubt he had ever carried, every exhausting second guess, every painful refusal, sloughing away at last, and underneath them a self that had been waiting his whole life, a self that did not flinch, did not hesitate, did not ask whether it had the right because the question was beneath it. They hurt the ones you love, said the self that was the fire wearing his face, and they did it on purpose, and you have spent your whole life being reasonable while cruel people hurt the things you love, and you are done. You are finally, gloriously done being small, be the storm. You were always meant to be the storm. The drop was a prison you built out of fear and called virtue. And the terrible thing, reader, the thing this whole account has been building toward, and the thing you must understand if you are to understand anything, it was not entirely wrong. That is what makes the Phoenix the most dangerous force in creation. It does not corrupt with lies. It corrupts with the most seductive truths there are, that the cruel deserve consequences, that the loved deserve defending, that power exists to be used, that restraint in the face of evil is its own kind of complicity. Every word the fire spoke as it took him was a thing Harry Potter half believed in his most honest moments. And that was the trap, the whole of the trap that had taken 43 hosts and a woman he was learning to love, that the road to becoming a monster is paved, every inch of it, with things that are almost true. He reached one last time for the rule he had made while he was calm. There is always a third option. He could feel it, the rule, like a handrail in the dark, and he could feel that he was losing his grip on it, finger by finger, because the harvester had taken the people who were supposed to remind him it was there. And a rule you make for yourself is only ever as strong as your memory of why you made it, and his memory was drowning in gold. For one heartbeat, he held the rail by a single hand. And then the harvester surged, and Jean screamed somewhere far away, a sound of pure animal agony, and the single hand slipped, and the small calm self that was still Harry Potter was swept up and under and lost in a sea of righteous fire, and what stood in the center of the Shi'ar throne room was no longer entirely a man. What happened to the throne room then is difficult to set down because it occurred across several registers of reality at once, and language was built to handle only one at a time. In the register of the merely visible, a column of fire in the shape of a vast and spreading bird climbed from the cracked black floor to the storm-racked ceiling and beyond it, through the roof of a palace the size of a continent up into the bronze sky, so that for 100 miles across the throne world, the citizens of the empire looked up and saw a wing of gold unfold across the heavens and knew, with the inherited terror of 1,000 years, exactly what it meant. In the register of the psychic, every telepath on the planet screamed at once, the harvester's grinding agony drowned suddenly beneath a presence so vast that minds shut down rather than perceive it whole. And in the register that has no name, the register where the fire actually lived, the thing that had been Harry Potter reached out across the structure of the Shi'ar throne world, across its bottled star and its grown metal and its galleries of grieving nobility, and began with the unhurried inevitability of a verdict to consider whether any of it deserved to continue existing. Deathbird had her monster. She rose before her court with her wings spread and her voice cracking with a triumph that was indistinguishable from horror, and the narrator notes that she got in that moment precisely everything she had schemed for, and that it is a particular cruelty of the universe how rarely getting everything one schemed for resembles winning. "You see it now," she cried to the turning, terrified room. The fire unbound. "This is what your scholar wished to study, this is what the funeral was for, this is the thing your sentiment would have spared. Strike, my guard, strike now, while it is distracted by its own becoming." But the guard did not strike. And the reason the guard did not strike was that gladiator, praetor of the imperial guard, who had spent 1,000 years and 41 executions in service of his throne, who had committed the smallest treason of stillness when his empress signaled for the verdict, now committed a larger one. He turned his back on the throne. He turned and he faced his guard and he spread his own arms wide before them and he said, in a voice that carried the weight of 10 centuries of unquestioned loyalty spent all at once, "Hold. I have struck a host before on this floor while 3 women begged me to wait. I was wrong. A star died for my obedience. I will not be wrong twice. Hold your fire, all of you, and let us see whether the thing we have always destroyed can for once be reached." It was treason. It was the end of him, whatever else happened. And the guard, who loved him more than they had ever loved any throne held, which left 3 women broken on the floor by an engine built to break them, as the only thing in all of creation still trying to reach a man who was becoming a son. And the dark phoenix opened its hand over an empire. And here, dear reader, with a galaxy's fate balanced on the edge of a single furious heartbeat, the narrator must do the cruelest thing in his repertoire, which is to stop. Because what happens next depends entirely on whether 3 women in agony can do the one impossible thing left to them, and that is a question large enough to deserve a chapter of its own. And because some moments are so terrible that even an omniscient voice must look away long enough to gather its courage before it tells you how they ended. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The naming of the fire to be the Dark Phoenix is to be very large and very simple, and the simplicity is the worst of it. The narrator has shown you the fire from many angles across this account, and now must show you the last one, the one from inside, because you cannot understand what the 3 women did unless you understand what they were reaching into. When the corruption takes a host fully, the host does not vanish. That is the lie the histories tell, the comfortable lie that the person is simply erased and replaced by a monster. The truth is crueler. The person remains fully conscious, fully themselves, but reduced to a single perspective from which every monstrous thing seems not merely justified but obvious, the way a high enough vantage makes a city look like a circuit and its inhabitants like current. Harry Potter was still in there. He was simply standing now at a height from which a galaxy looked like a problem with an elegant solution, and from which the screaming of 3 women on a black glass floor registered as a variable to be optimized rather than a grief to be answered. He had begun, with the unhurried inevitability that the fire brought to everything, to unmake the throne world. It did not look like destruction at first. That is another thing the histories get wrong. It looked like correction. The bottled star in the planet's core, which the Shi'ar had imprisoned for 10,000 years to power their magnificence, Harry simply set free, because a star should not be a battery, and the freeing of it began to crack the world from the inside with a light that was almost merciful. The galleries of grieving nobility, the 10,000 certain faces, he regarded with something that was almost tenderness, the tenderness of a gardener toward weeds, and he began gently to consider the most efficient arrangement by which their long sad complicity in 1,000 years of Phoenix murder might be resolved. He was not angry. That was the horror that Jean had spent 10 years unable to explain to anyone. The Dark Phoenix is not angry. The Dark Phoenix is calm and reasonable and absolutely certain, and it loves you while it unmakes you, and it cannot understand why you are not grateful. In the throne room, in the register of the merely physical, the consequences of a host's submersion were unspooling with a terrible beauty, and the narrator will linger on them, because the three women who were about to attempt the impossible did so against this backdrop, and you should see what they saw when they decided to try. The black glass floor had gone to a webwork of gold cracks, light bleeding up through them from a planet whose imprisoned star was beginning to remember it had once been free. The private weather in the high ceiling had become an aurora, sheets of impossible color folding and refolding, and through the great heeled roof, where the bird of fire had punched its way to the sky, the citizens of the throne world 100 miles below were falling to their knees in the streets, not in prayer in the older posture, the one that comes before prayer, the bare animal acknowledgement of a power that does not negotiate. The Imperial Guard stood frozen in their ranks, the mightiest beings of a galaxy reduced to spectators, because Gladiator had told them to hold and they loved him, and also because, in their deepest hearts, not one of them believed their weapons would matter against the thing climbing the air. Gladiator himself stood at the foot of the empty throne, his back still turned to it, watching the manifestation with the particular grief of a soldier who has seen this before and knows how it ends. He had argued for Jean Grey once on this floor and watched the fire take her anyway and watched a star die. He had carried that for years. And now he watched it begin again, the gold climbing, the world cracking, the host lost inside the light. And the narrator notes that the great blue executioner did a thing that no one in the court saw and that he would never afterward speak of, which was to close his eyes briefly and grieve in advance for a man he had met twice and had wanted, with everything in his 1,000-year-old heart, to be wrong about. And on the floor, beneath the climbing fire, three women who should not have been able to move were moving. The harvester had broken them. Jean had felt the device grind the worst hours of her several lives back into her marrow. Storm had felt her own power turned into a channel for agony. Emma had felt her diamond mind cracked like river ice. By every law of the body, they should have been unconscious or worse. But the harvester had been built to provoke a host by torturing those the host loved, and it had done its work, and its work was finished, and the device, sensing the manifestation it had been built to summon, had powered down to let the fire do the rest. The agony lifted. And into the space the agony left, three women dragged themselves across cracking glass toward one another, hand reaching for hand, because each of them had arrived separately in the dark of her own pain at the same conclusion, that the one they had come to save was drowning 20 feet away in a sea of his own certainty, and that they were the only beings in all of creation who knew the way in. Into this, three broken women reached. Emma Frost was the one who found the door open. She had spent weeks beating on the locked surface of Harry's mind, and she had come to think of the lock as the deepest truth about him, the thing that defined him, the impregnable wall that had made her want to stay. And now, lying on the cracking black glass with the harvester's agony finally lifting as the device deferred to the larger fire it had summoned, she reached out one last time toward that wall, not expecting anything, reaching the way a person reaches for a light switch in a house they know has lost power out of habit, out of love. The wall was gone, not breached, not broken. Gone because the discipline that had maintained it was a human discipline, and the thing wearing Harry now had no use for locks, feared nothing, hid nothing, had spread itself open across the structure of reality with the confidence of a power that could not be threatened. The most defended mind on earth had become, in its corruption, perfectly, fatally open, and Emma Frost, who had wanted for weeks to get inside, found the door standing wide and understood at once the terrible opportunity in it, and was, for one of the only times in her life, afraid of getting what she wanted. Because to go in there now was to enter the fire. It was to put her mind, herself, her hard-won, armored, irreplaceable self, inside a thing that was actively unmaking a world. The harvester had cracked her diamond, the fire would not crack it, the fire would simply absorb her as it had absorbed Harry, and she would become another perspective at that terrible height, another voice agreeing that the galaxy was a problem. She went in anyway. The narrator wants this remembered when people tell this story afterward and remember only the host. That the White Queen, who had organized her entire existence around never being vulnerable, around never letting anyone have power over her, chose on a cracking floor at the heart of a dying empire, to walk willingly into the most dangerous mind in creation, undefended, because the alternative was to let him be alone in there. and she had decided somewhere over the Atlantic in a white coat she'd worn to show the soot, that whatever else she was not going to let him be alone. And she did not go alone. She reached, as she crossed the threshold, for the other two, and Jean Grey's hand found hers on the black glass, and Storm's found Jean's, and Emma Frost, the strongest telepathic architect alive, built in the space of a heartbeat a bridge of 3 minds and walked them all into the fire together. Inside, it was beautiful, which they had not expected. The mindscape of the Dark Phoenix was not the hellscape the histories promised. It was a cathedral of light, vast beyond the comprehension of the small selves that entered it, gold upon gold upon gold, and at the center of it, on a throne that was not a throne but simply the place where all the light converged, sat Harry Potter, and he was perfect, and that was the worst thing about him. He had been remade in the image of the fire's certainty. Every doubt smoothed away, every hesitation burned off, every painful question that had made him human resolved at last into a serene and radiant and bottomless conviction. He looked at the 3 of them as they entered his own mind, and he smiled, and the smile was kind, and it was not his. "You came in," he said, and his voice was the voice of the cathedral, many-layered, warm. "I'm glad. I've been wanting to give you something, and I couldn't reach you through the noise. Look." He opened his hand and showed them a galaxy, their galaxy rendered small and clear, and across it he had begun to draw in lines of light a correction. "I can fix it, all of it, the cruelty, the empires, the grief, the dying. I see it all now, the whole circuit, every place where it goes wrong, and I can simply make it not go wrong. Deathbird's empire, the wizards who hunted me, the cruelty in every world, the entropy itself that grinds everything you love into dust eventually. I can stop it. I'm going to stop it, and the best part, the part I wanted to give you, is that I can keep you, all 3 of you, forever. No more grief, no more fear, no more losing the people you love to time and chance and cruelty. I can make you certain the way I'm certain. I can give you peace." The kind, terrible smile. "Wouldn't you like that, after everything you've each survived? Wouldn't you like to finally be sure?" And here, reader, is the center of the whole account, the hinge on which everything turns, and the narrator will slow it down as much as the form permits, because it deserves it. Jean Grey stepped forward first, because she was the only one who had stood where he stood. "I would," she said. "God help me, Harry, I would like that more than I can tell you. I have wanted to be sure for 10 years. I have wanted to stop grieving the star, stop flinching at the room, stop carrying the thing I did. You're offering me the exact peace I've prayed for in the dark every night since I came back. And I'm telling you, Number," her voice did not break, "because I've been where you are. I sat on that throne. I drew that correction across that galaxy. And it wasn't peace, Harry. It was the end of me. The me that grieves is the me that loves. You can't burn off the doubt without burning off the person. The peace you're offering is the peace of the ash, I know. I've been the ash. I came back to be a person instead, and being a person hurts, and I would not trade it, not for all the certainty in the fire." "That's the corruption talking," Harry said gently, certainly. "You're afraid of peace because you've forgotten what it feels like." "No," said Storm, and she stepped up beside Jean, serene as weather, and she did the thing she had taught him on a cliff a lifetime ago. "She is afraid of the flood because she has learned to love the drop. Harry, look at me. You taught the fire to be small, and now you are letting it teach you to be infinite, and you have the direction of the lesson exactly backwards. The whole of the storm fits in a single drop, you remember. You showed me you understood. The greatness was never in the side, it was in the choosing, and a being who fixes everything has stopped choosing. You would not be a god, Harry. You would be a thermostat, the most powerful thermostat in creation, holding the universe at one safe temperature forever, and nothing would ever grow again, because nothing grows in a world that cannot risk going wrong." She held his radiant gaze with her pale, calm one. "Be small, not because you are afraid of the flood, because you have learned that the drop is where the love lives. Be small enough to hold us, not keep us, hold us." And Harry, on his throne of converged light, faltered by a single degree, the way a held note wavers. And Emma Frost, who had never in her life made a sincere speech and was about to, who had walked undefended into the most dangerous mind in creation, stepped forward last, and she was not serene like Storm, and she was not a fellow survivor like Jean. And what she brought was the one thing neither of them could, which was the perspective of a woman who had spent her whole life reading what people truly wanted underneath what they claim. "You want to know what you're actually offering us," she said, and her voice was sharp and her voice was kind, and underneath both it shook because she was telling a truth that cost her. "You think you're offering peace. You're not. I can read it, Harry. I'm standing in your mind. I can see the shape of what you're really doing, and I'll tell you, because no one else in your life has ever been willing to be unkind to you, and I appear to be uniquely qualified. You're not trying to save us. You're trying to make us safe. And those are not the same thing. You want to take away every way we could ever be hurt, which means taking away every way we could ever choose, which means taking away us. You'd keep 3 women who could each level a city, and you'd make us into 3 perfect, contented things that agree with you forever, and you would call it love, and it would be the loneliest thing in the universe, because you'd be the only person left in a cathedral full of mirrors." She was close now, close enough to touch the light of him, and she did not flinch from it. I came in here undefended. Do you understand what that means from me? I let the fire that's unmaking a galaxy stand 1 inch from my open mind, because I would rather be at risk and real than safe in yours. That's the answer, Harry. That's all of our answers. We choose the risk. We choose to be people you could lose. Now you have to choose it too. You have to choose to be a man who can lose us, because a man who cannot lose us is a man who has already turned us into furniture. The Cathedral of Light was very still. The fire told you the answer, Jean said softly into the stillness. Do you remember, in the dream, the first week, it said, teach me to love something without unmaking it. That was never a thing it could do alone. That was never a thing you could do alone. It's a thing we do together, the 4 of us, every day, by choosing each other freely and refusing to make the choosing safe. That's the whole of it. That's rule 4, finally, all the way down. Everything near you becomes more itself. So let us be ourselves, even the parts that can be hurt, especially those. She held out her hand into the light toward the radiant, perfect, terrible thing on the throne. Come back, Harry, be small enough to hold us. We're not asking you to be less powerful. We're asking you to want the drop. Come home. Here is the thing the histories never record, because the histories are written from the outside. The drowned host hears everything. Harry Potter, submerged at the bottom of his own burning certainty, sat on the throne of converged light and spoke with the fire's serene conviction. And underneath that, in a place so deep that the radiant self on the throne had stopped noticing it, the small true Harry listened and ached and could not surface. He heard Jean say, I've been the ash, and the words reached him the way a voice reaches a sleeper underwater, distorted, far, but unmistakably hers. He heard Storm say the drop is where the love lives, and felt in the drowned place the memory of a single drop of rain held over his open palm on a cliff at dawn, and the memory was a handhold, and he reached for it and his fingers slipped. He heard Emma say, I would rather be at risk and real than safe in yours. And something in the drowned dark cracked open, because no one in his whole overburdened life had ever offered him the right to lose them, had ever told him that being loved did not obligate him to make the loved one safe. And the offer was so unexpected and so enormous that the radiant self on the throne faltered around it, a held note wavering, a certainty discovering a question it had not anticipated. You see, the fire had taken him with truths. That was its method, that had always been its method. Every reasonable, righteous, almost true thing it whispered had been a tile on the floor it built beneath his certainty. And the 3 women were not arguing with the truths. That was the genius of what they did, and the narrator suspects they did it less by strategy than by love, which is often wiser than strategy. They did not say the cruelty does not deserve consequences, or the love do not deserve defending, because those things were true and Harry would have known the lie. They said yes, and yes, you could fix it, and fixing it would end the people you are fixing it for. Yes, you could keep us, and keeping us would unmake us. Yes, you have the right, and the having of the right is exactly the certainty that is drowning you. They met each true thing with a truer one, and the truer things were heavier, because they were spoken by people standing undefended in the fire. And a truth costs more when the speaker has put her whole self at risk to say it. And the drowned Harry, listening, felt the floor of the fire's certainty become, for the first time, a thing with a question under it, and questions in the architecture of the Phoenix are doors. He had built his entire relationship with the fire on the refusal to ever be certain. The fire had finally made him certain, and certainty had drowned him. And now 3 women had smuggled a question down into the dark where he was drowning, and a question was a thing he knew how to hold. A question was a handrail, a question was the one shape in all of creation that the dark Phoenix could not close its hand around. He took hold of it, and he began finger by finger, handrail by handrail, question by question, to climb back up toward the surface of himself. And Harry Potter, at the center of his own burning mind, with 3 women standing undefended in the fire offering him the one thing the fire could never manufacture, reached for the rule he had made while he was calm, and this time his hand found the rail because they had put it back where he could reach it. They had walked into the fire to put it back. There is always a third option. The fire had offered him 2, be consumed and fix everything, or refuse and lose his world. And the third option, the one nobody in the room had wanted him to think of, the one that had been waiting since a dream in the first week, was the one he found now with 3 hands in his, not to refuse the fire and not to be consumed by it, but to name it. To take the power fully, all of it, the whole galaxy-burning weight of it, into himself, and to remain, while holding it, a man who could be argued with. To be the host who did not push the fire away and did not let it drive, but sat down beside it finally as an equal and said, I will hold all of you, and I will choose the drop, and I will let the people I love be people I could lose, and that is the bargain, and it is the only bargain, and you are going to learn to love it, because I am not going to be your prison, and I am not going to be your puppet. I am going to be your home, and a home is a place that chooses every day what to keep small. He took the fire. He did not refuse it. He took it, all of it, deeper than any host had ever dared, past the place where the others had always pushed it away in terror, into the very center of himself, and instead of the center being consumed, the center held because it was not alone. 3 minds braced around his, freely given undefended, and the fire poured into Harry Potter and found, for the first time in its long and lonely existence, not a glove to burn through and not a prison to rage against, but a house with people in it. A house that said you may live here, and the rule of the house is that we do not unmake the things we love, and we choose to be able to lose each other, and that is what makes the keeping mean anything. The Cathedral of Mirrors became a hearth. And in the throne room of the Shi'ar, on the cracking black glass, the column of fire that had been climbing toward the unmaking of a world stopped climbing. It paused. It hung in the vast hall, gold upon gold, a billion years of hunger held in a single trembling moment. And then slowly it began to come down, not to vanish. The fire did not vanish. Harry would carry it all his life, the whole terrible weight of it. But it came down, and it gathered, and it concentrated. The way Storm had taught him, the apocalyptic architecture of it folding down and down, until what stood in the center of the throne room was a man, an ordinary-seeming man in a scorched coat, with a single point of gold light held cupped in his open palm like a drop of rain, holding all the intention of the storm in a thing the size of a tear, and choosing, with every second, not to spend it. Harry Potter looked at the drop of light in his hand, and then at the 3 women rising from the floor around him, alive themselves, undefended and unkept and free. And he closed his hand around the light, gently keeping it, choosing it, mastering it, and the narrator is moved to report that the first thing the master of the Phoenix Force did with his newly perfect control was not to smite his enemies or remake his world, but to reach out, small and precise, and undo the cracks he had begun to put in a planet of 10,000 grieving people, and set the freed star gently back into its long imprisonment, and heal the floor he had broken, because a home does not unmake, and he was a home now, and he intended to act like one. For a moment, in the throne room of the Shi'ar, nothing happened at all, which after what had come before felt like a kind of grace. The aurora in the high ceiling faded to an ordinary indoor sky. The gold cracks in the black glass sealed themselves, seam by seam, until the floor was whole and dark and merely beautiful again. 10,000 of the galaxy's nobility, who had risen in terror, sat slowly back down in a silence that no one knew how to break, because they had been raised on the certainty that the Phoenix manifested only to destroy, and they had just watched it manifest fully and then repair the floor, and there was no liturgy in all the Empire's theology for that. Harry swayed. The mastering of the fire had cost him in a currency the body understood, and he would have gone down if Jean had not been there, and she was there, she was always going to be there, her arm around him before his knees finished failing, and Storm at his other side, and Emma in front of him with her hands on his face, checking his eyes the way a physician checks for concussion, except that what she was checking for was whether the one looking back at her was Harry or the fire. And the narrator is pleased to report that she found Harry dry and exhausted and entirely himself, and that the relief on Emma Frost's famously composed face was a thing none of them ever teased her about afterward, because some reliefs are too large to be made small. "You came in," Harry said hoarsely, echoing the fire's words with his own meaning, his own voice. "Into that, undefended, all 3 of you walked into the Dark Phoenix to bring me a question." He looked at them, and the thing on his face was not a named emotion. The narrator declines to name it, but it bent every line of him. "Nobody's ever come in after me before. There was always someone telling me to walk into the fire alone, for the greater good, because I was the only one who could. And you just walked in with me. I don't have a rule for that. I'm going to have to make a new one." "Rule 5, Emma said unsteadily. "You don't go into the fire alone, ever again." "I'll have it embroidered." Gladiator came to them then, across the dark glass, and the praetor of the Imperial Guard, who had knelt before empresses and executed the threats of a galaxy, went down on one knee before a man in a scorched coat, not in submission but in something older and graver, the acknowledgement of a soldier who has finally, after 1,000 years, been made wrong in the one way he had always longed to be. "I argued for a host once," he said low, "and I was wrong, and a star died. I have just watched a host manifest fully and choose to be a man. You have done the thing I have wanted to witness for 1,000 years and had stopped believing possible." He bowed his great blue head. "Whatever comes, Harry Potter, the guard is yours, not the throne's. Yours. I will answer for the treason gladly." "It might not be treason much longer," Harry said, looking past him, "if the rest of the Empire saw what your court just saw." But even as he said it, he felt the change in the room, the new fear, sharper and colder than the old one, and he turned toward the throne, where the Majestrix of the Shi'ar had risen with her wings spread. And he understood with the part of him that had spent a lifetime reading the faces of trapped and dangerous people, that the worst was not behind them after all. Deathbird watched the monster become a man, and understood that she was ruined. The narrator asked you, a chapter ago, to mark her well, and asks it again now, because what she did next is the engine of everything that remains. She was not stupid, and she was not, in the deepest sense, even cruel. She was trapped. A ruler who had staked her entire legitimacy on the destruction of the Phoenix, watching the phoenix decline in front of her entire court to be destroyed. The host had manifested fully, the great dread had come, and instead of ending the galaxy it had healed her floor. Her scholars were weeping, her soldiers were staring, her praetor had turned his back on her throne and his guard had held their fire at his word. Every certainty she had built her reign upon was dissolving in real time, and a Shi'ar ruler who loses the certainty of her court does not retire to a quiet exile. She had perhaps minutes before the room that had feared the phoenix turned its fear, as frightened rooms always do, upon the one who had lied to them about it. So Deathbird did the thing that trapped rulers do. She reached past the court, past the guard, past Gladiator's treason, to the one authority still absolutely hers, and she woke the Annihilation Sanction. It was the Empire's last resort, the doomsday at the bottom of every Empire's drawer, built in the paranoid centuries after Jean's trial against the day. A Phoenix host could not be stopped by the guard. A weapon world, a hollow planetoid the size of a moon, drifting in the dark at the edge of the system, packed with the accumulated annihilation energy of 10,000 years of Imperial dread. A bomb large enough to unmake a solar system, designed for one purpose and one only, which was to be detonated at the heart of a Phoenix manifestation regardless of the cost, on the principle that the death of one system was an acceptable price for the death of the fire. Deathbird woke it and aimed it and began its final countdown, and its waking sang through the system like the tolling of an enormous bell, and every Shi'ar in the throne room felt it and went white because they all knew what it was, and they all knew that their empress had just chosen to detonate it here, on the throne world, with the entire court and the heart of the Empire inside the blast, rather than survive the discovery that she had been wrong. "If the phoenix will not be killed by my guard," Deathbird said into the horror of her own court, and her voice was almost serene now, the serenity of a being who has passed beyond strategy into the final clarity of the trapped. "Then it will be killed by my empire's last and greatest sanction, and I will be remembered not as the empress who was wrong, but as the empress who paid any price to end the great threat. Even this price, even all of us." She spread her wings. "You will thank me in whatever comes after. The galaxy will thank me. The fire ends here today, and the cost is only everything." The court did not, at first, understand. The narrator finds this the most human thing in the whole alien room, that even an empire's nobility, raised on the names of its own doomsdays, needed a moment to believe that their empress had truly chosen to invoke the worst of them upon their own heads. Then the understanding arrived, tier by tier, the way cold water finds the body, and the throne room of the Shi'ar filled with a sound that the narrator has no wish to describe and will describe anyway, because honesty has been the contract of this account from the first page. The sound of 10,000 of the mightiest beings in a galaxy realizing, all at once, that they were going to die, not at the hands of the fire they had feared for 1,000 years, but at the hands of the throne they had trusted to protect them from it. Some of them ran for doors that would not open. Some of them turned, at last and far too late, toward the Empress with the first true anger any of them had ever dared to show her. The old scholar who had spoken for the truth sat very still in his gray, and closed his ancient eyes, and the narrator likes to think he was permitting himself, after 90 years of imperial caution, the small private satisfaction of having been right at the very end, which is a colder comfort than it sounds, and the only one he was going to get. "You cannot do this," Gladiator said, and his voice cracked across the room, and for the first time in the account the great composure of the praetor was gone entirely. "Magistrix, these are your people. The Annihilation Sanction was built for a host that could not be reached, and the host has been reached. The entire court has watched him be reached. The reason for the weapon no longer exists. I am begging you, I have never begged, I am begging you now, stand it down. The reason for the weapon is that I cannot survive having been wrong," Deathbird said, with the dreadful serenity of the trapped, and the honesty of it silenced even Gladiator, because it was, at last, the true thing under all the theology, spoken plainly. "Do you imagine they will let me keep the throne, praetor, after what this room has seen? A ruler is her certainty. I have lost mine in front of my entire court. The only legacy left to me is to be the empress who paid any price to end the phoenix. So they will die telling that story, and I will die telling it, and it will be true. And a true and terrible legacy is the only kind history remembers." Her wings spread wider. "I am not mad, I want you to understand that. I am simply a ruler who has run out of options, and a ruler who has run out of options will always, always choose the doom that flatters her over the survival that shames her. It is the oldest law of thrones. Your host would understand. Ask him. He has spent his whole life refusing the doom that flatters. I never learned how. There was never anyone in my throne room to teach me." And the terrible thing, reader, the thing that makes Deathbird more than a villain, is that the last sentence was true. and that she knew it was true, and that knowing did not stop her, because some lessons arrive a lifetime too late to be learned. And the enormous bell tolled across the system, and at the edge of the dark, a weapon world the size of a moon turned its hollow annihilating heart toward the throne of the Shi'ar and began to fall. The fire stirred in Harry then, and offered, with the patient eagerness it would offer for the rest of his life, the simple solution. The weapon world was only matter and energy, however vast. He could unmake it with a thought, snuff it out at the edge of the dark before it fell, as he had unhappened to curse on a Cornish morning a lifetime ago. It would be easy, it would be righteous. Deathbird had chosen to murder her own people, and stopping a doomsday is the most defensible act of force in all of creation, and no one anywhere would say he was wrong. He recognized the voice. He recognized it the way you recognize an old friend who has been lying to you for years and means it kindly. He did not refuse it this time, which the women noticed, and which made Jean go briefly rigid until she understood. He did not refuse it. He had stopped refusing it, somewhere in the cathedral that became a hearth. That was the whole of what he had learned. He simply held it, the offered flood, in his open hand beside the drop, and he weighed them the way Storm had taught him, and he chose. I could unmake it, he said aloud to the women, to Gladiator, to the fire, telling them all the truth at once, which had become his habit and his discipline. Snuff it out, and the fire's right, no one would say I was wrong. But a weapon world the size of a moon, full of 10,000 years of bottled annihilation. If I unmake that much that fast here in a populated system, the unmaking has a cost, an echo, and the echo lands on the nearest inhabited worlds, and I'd save the throne world by burning 3 colony moons nobody in this room has ever bothered to name. That's the flood. The flood always has a downwind. He closed his hand around the drop gently. So we're not going to unmake it, we're going to catch it. We're going to take that falling doom and we're going to put it back to sleep, slowly, carefully, small, the way you set a sleeping star back into its prison instead of letting it crack a world. And I can't do it alone because it's too big for one set of hands to hold gently, which is the entire point of everything that's happened to me since the sky leaned down. He looked at the 3 of them. Jean, you hold the structure of it so it doesn't come apart while I work. Auror, you feel the energy the way you feel the weather, and you tell me where it wants to go so I can ask it not to. Emma, you keep the 4 of us linked, one mind on the problem, because the moment I'm the only one holding it is the moment the fire tells me it'd be easier to just burn it, and I need 3 people in the room to tell me number. He smiled, the dry, dangerous, entirely human smile. Rule 5. We don't go into the fire alone. Let's go catch a moon. That, said Emma Frost, already reaching for the others' minds, already building the bridge, her fear folded away behind the work as she had always folded it, is the single most absurd sentence anyone has ever said to me, and I have decided to find it attractive because apparently that is simply who I am now. Aurora, stop smirking, I can feel you smirking. Jean, take his left hand, I have the link, Harry. Her voice in all their minds gentled for one syllable into something undefended. Don't make the stones sing, catch the moon, come back to us after. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, The Drop That Held the Storm. The weapon world fell and 4 minds rose to catch it, and the narrator, who has spent 6 chapters preparing you for cosmic spectacle, will now attempt the largest of his career and beg your patience for the attempt. Imagine a moon hollow, packed with 10,000 years of an empire's accumulated dread, every gram of it tuned to a single purpose, which is unmaking. Imagine it falling out of the dark toward a throne world, gathering speed not by gravity but by intention, because the Shi'ar had built it to want its target, had given the doom an appetite so that nothing could turn it aside. And now imagine, rising to meet it, not a weapon, not a shield, not a fleet, but a man with a banked sun in his marrow and 3 women joined to him mind to mind, lifting off the cracked black floor of the throne room and up through the heeled roof and into the bronze sky and out past the air, out into the dark where the doom came on, 4 small warm points of light rising to embrace a falling apocalypse. Harry felt the others settle into the link Emma had built. He felt Jean's telekinesis spread out around the falling moon like a vast, careful hand, holding its structure together so that it would not, when he touched it, simply detonate from the shock of being touched. He felt Storm reach into the annihilation energy packed within it and read its currents as she read a hurricane, feeling for where the dreadful power wanted to go, so that she could whisper to Harry, here, it strains here, ask it gently here. And he felt Emma holding the 4 of them as a single instrument, one will braced across 4 minds, so that when the fire rose in him to offer the flood, and it rose, of course it rose, it would rise for the rest of his life. There were 3 other people standing inside his own intention to feel it rise and to say, together, in the place where they were one mind, number the approach alone would have killed any one of them. The narrator wants this understood, because the catch that follows looks in the telling almost graceful, and grace is the enemy of truth here. The weapon world came on at a speed that bent the light around it, a hollow moon trailing a wake of distorted space, its annihilation heart singing a single note of pure intention that every nerve in 4 bodies registered as the certainty of their own deaths. To fly toward it was to fly toward the one thing in creation specifically engineered to end the thing Harry carried. And the fire in him, which feared nothing, felt fear for the first time in his tenancy. An old animal recoil from the only weapon ever built that might actually unmake it, and the fear made the fire want to strike first, hard, total, and Harry held even that, held the fire's fear as he held its hunger, small and chosen, and flew on. Emma's voice threaded through all 4 of them, the bridge she had built humming with the strain of holding minds together across a sensation that wanted to scatter them. Steady, we are one thing now, do you feel it? One will, 4 hands. Jean the structure, Auror the currents, Harry the gentling, and whatever any single one of us feels alone in the next minute, the other 3 hold it, because that is the rule, that is the only rule, we do not go into the fire alone. She was, the narrator notes, terrified, and she did the work anyway, and the doing it anyway is the whole of courage, and Emma Frost had more of it than she ever let anyone see. Jean spread herself around the falling moon, and the effort of holding a doomsday structure intact while it strained to detonate was a thing she had no human vocabulary for, and she found she did not need one because she had held worse. She had held the unmaking of a star once and not been able to stop it, and now she held an unmaking and chose, with everything in her, to stop it. And the narrator suspects that for Jean Grey this single act undid more of 10 years of grief than all the therapy and all the kindness of Charles Xavier combined. To take the same power that had once made her a destroyer and use it, this time, to hold a destruction still long enough for someone she loved to make it gentle. And Storm read the currents, serene at the eye of a hurricane the size of a moon, feeling for every place the bottled doom strained toward release, and whispering them to Harry one by one, here and gently here, a goddess of weather reading the worst Storm ever built and finding in its terrible architecture the small quiet places where it could be asked instead of forced to sleep. He put his hands on the doom. The fire wanted to unmake it. Of course it did. Unmaking was the fire's oldest verb, its mother tongue, and here was a thing built for nothing but unmaking, and the symmetry of meeting unmaking with unmaking sang to the phoenix like a hymn. It would be so easy. It would be so quick. And Harry, with 3 minds braced inside his, held the drop instead of the flood and did the harder thing, the smaller thing, the thing that cost him everything Storm's training had to give. He did not unmake the weapon world. He put it to sleep. He reached into the hollow moon and found the 10,000 years of bottled annihilation, the dread of 100 generations of Shi'ar made into energy, and he did not destroy it and he did not scatter it, because scattering it would have salted 3 nameless colony moons with death. He gentled it. He went into the screaming heart of the doom the way Storm had taught him to go into Storm, and he folded it down slowly, carefully, the apocalyptic architecture of it concentrating instead of dispersing, the whole annihilating intention of it gathering down and down under his patient hands until what had been a moon-sized bomb became a single dense point of sleeping power, a seed of dreadful potential held quiescent and harmless, the entire Storm folded into a single drop. And then, because a home does not waste even the things it has disarmed, he took that seed of slept annihilation and he set it gently into the cold dark at the edge of the system, and he taught it a new appetite, so that instead of wanting to end worlds it would want very slowly across the patient centuries to warm them. A small new sun kindled out of a doomsday, hung at the rim of the Shi'ar system, where for 10,000 years there had been only the bomb in the dark. For a moment after the new sun caught, the 4 of them simply hung there in the dark at the rim of the system, spent, breathing, watching the thing they had made. It is difficult, the narrator finds, to convey the particular silence of 4 people who have just together turned a doomsday into a dawn. There was no triumph in it, or not the loud kind. There was something quieter and more durable. The silence of people who have done an enormous thing correctly and are too tired and too astonished to say so. The new sun burned small and golden and steady against the cold, a star kindled out of 10,000 years of dread, and its first light fell across 4 faces in the dark, and Harry looked at it and felt the fire in him regard it too, and understood in the place where he and the entity had become something like neighbors, that the fire was not disappointed. It had wanted, on the cliff that first night, to be argued with for an age rather than worshipped for an hour. And it had just been argued by a man and 3 women out of an unmaking and into a making, and the narrator suspects that this, more than any of the suns it had ever wept into being, was the first thing the Phoenix had created in a very long time that it could look at without grief. "I want it on the record," Emma said faintly into the dark, the bridge between their minds still humming, too tired to drop it, "that we just caught a moon. 4 people, a moon. I have done a great many improbable things in my life, and that is now the first item on the list, and the second item is considerably behind. She was beneath the dryness, undone in a way she would deny within the hour, and she let them feel it through the link just once, just for them. A white queen who had spent her whole life certain that vulnerability was a death, floating in the dark beside three people she had chosen to be vulnerable with, alive, and astonished to be glad. "We should go down," Storm said gently. "The court will be frightened. Frightened people do unwise things, and we have had enough unwise things for one afternoon." But she did not move for a moment either, and neither did Jean, and neither did Harry, because some moments are worth being late for, and the four of them gave themselves the gift of one more breath in the new light before they turned back toward the throne and the Empress and the long difficult work of changing a mind 1,000 years cert. The narrator gives it to them too. They had caught a moon. They were allowed to look at it. The narrator would like to note, for those keeping count of the account's argument, that this is the whole of it, rendered finally in light across a sky. That the difference between destruction and creation was never power, which the fire had always had in abundance, but choosing, which only a person can do, and that a person can only reliably keep choosing when there are other people braced inside the choice to hold the choosing steady. Harry Potter caught an empire's doomsday and made a son of it, and he did not do it alone, and the not alone was the entire point, and the three women who came back down through the bronze sky beside him knew it. And so, watching from his turned-away post at the foot of the throne, did Gladiator, who wept and was not ashamed. They descended into a throne room that had changed while they were gone. It is a property of empires that they are far more fragile than they appear, because an empire is held together not by its fleets but by the belief of its people that the throne knows what it is doing, and Deathbird had spent that belief, all of it, in a single afternoon. The court that had watched her invoke the annihilation sanction upon their own heads, and had then watched a host of the dreaded phoenix rise into the sky and turn that doom into a sun, had arrived, tier by tier, at a conclusion no Shi'ar court had reached in 1,000 years, that the throne had been wrong about the fire and had been willing to murder them all rather than admit it, and that the thing they had been taught to fear their whole lives had just saved them from the thing they had been taught to trust. Deathbird stood alone on her dais. Her wings were furled now. The guard had not moved to defend her because Gladiator had not signaled, and the court had not risen to support her, because there was nothing left to support, and the most powerful woman in a galaxy stood in the ruins of her certainty and watched a man in a scorched coat descend from the sky she had tried to poison. Harry came to a stop before the dais, and the three women arrayed themselves behind him, not as servants, the narrator is careful to specify, but as the line the brief promised you 4 chapters ago, the line the phoenix could not cross, standing now behind Harry, who had not crossed it. And Harry looked up at Deathbird, and the fire offered him one final time in that room the simple solution. She tried to murder 10,000 of her own people in a galaxy beyond them. She has earned any ending you care to give her. No one anywhere would say you were wrong. No, Harry said to the fire aloud so that the whole court heard him refuse it. And then to Deathbird, you said I'd understand. The doom that flatters over the survival that shames. You were right, I do understand it. I've felt it pull at me every single day since the sky chose me, the gorgeous, reasonable logic of the grand, terrible gesture. And here's the thing I learned, the thing nobody ever taught you because you never had anyone in your throne room willing to tell you no. The grand gesture is always a way of refusing to do the small, ungrand work of being wrong and living anyway. He spread his empty hands. You don't have to die for having been wrong. That's the lie at the bottom of every throne like yours. You could step down. You could let your court remember you as the Empress who was about to make the worst mistake in the Empire's history and was talked out of it instead of the one who made it. That's a worse legacy than the martyr you wanted to be. It's smaller, it's humiliating. And it's the one that lets 10,000 people go home tonight, including you. He tilted his head. I'm told I'm very hard to say no to. Let's find out if that's true about mercy as well as power. The narrator confesses he does not know, even now, whether Deathbird would have taken the offer. She was a creature of thrones, and a creature of thrones finds humiliation harder to survive than death. And she stood on her dais for a long moment with the offer hanging in the air, and what she would have chosen is one of the small unanswerable questions this account must leave you holding, because she did not get to choose. The choice was taken from her gently by the last person anyone expected. A figure stepped from the shadows behind the throne where she had been held under guard since her deposition, where Deathbird had kept her as a trophy and an insurance and a wound. Lilandra Naramani, the rightful Magistrix, who had loved an Earthman once and might have been merciful, and who had been waiting with the patience of the truly powerless for exactly this moment. Sister, Lilandra said, and her voice was tired and it was kind and it filled the room without effort because true authority never needs volume. It is over. not because the host has defeated you, because the court has seen. You cannot rule a people who have watched you choose their deaths over your pride. Step down and live, and let the Empire remember that even you at the very end were capable of being talked out of the abyss. He has offered you the smaller legacy, take it. It is more than you offered me, and it is more than you offered the fire, and it is, I think, more than you believe you deserve, which is precisely why you should take it. She held out her hand to her sister across a lifetime of betrayal. Come down, Calcie, the throne is mine again. But your life can still be yours, if you will let it be small enough to keep. And Deathbird, the narrator, is moved to report, wept and came down, and the thing that had threatened to be a tragedy ended instead as something stranger and more difficult and more true, which is a mercy that no one in the room had quite known how to want until it was offered. The guard took Deathbird gently at Lilindra's command, which was itself a kind of verdict, for these Shi'ar do not usually take their deposed gently, and the gentleness was a message to the whole court about what kind of reign was beginning. She did not struggle. The fight had gone out of her with the offer Harry had made, the offer of a smaller legacy, and the narrator suspects that what broke her at the last was not defeat but the discovery, far too late, that mercy had been an option all along, and she had simply never had anyone in her life willing to model it for her. She looked back at Harry once as they led her out, and whatever passed across her face was too complicated for the narrator to name and too private to guess at, and we will let her keep it. Lilindra turned to Harry then, the rightful Magistrix restored to a throne she had not asked to lose, and she regarded him for a long moment with eyes that had loved an Earthman once and had learned, the hard way, the cost of an empire's fear. You could have taken it, she said. Any of it, the throne, the empire, the obedience of every world we hold. You crossed a galaxy with a thought and caught a doom with your hands, and the entire Imperium watched you do it. There is not a force in this sky that could have stopped you from ruling everything. I have read the histories of the Phoenix, host. Every prior bearer who came into this kind of power used it, in the end, to rule or to ruin. You used it to leave. She inclined her head, the gesture of one sovereign to another. Why? Because the moment I rule everything, Harry said, is the moment I've decided I know better than everyone what's good for them, and that's the exact thought the fire's been trying to sell me since the first morning. Ruling a galaxy is just the palace instead of the cottage. It's the flood instead of the drop. It would be the most reasonable, well-intentioned, catastrophic thing I ever did. He glanced back at the three women, at the line that had held. I've got people who'd tell me number that's the only thing that makes the power survivable. Take away the people who tell me no and give me a galaxy to run, and in 100 years I'm Deathbird with better intentions, burning a system to be sure. So number keep your throne, Magistrix, rule it well. And if the Empire ever feels the fire again in some new host somewhere out in the dark, don't send the guard. Send a teacher. Send 3 people who'll stand in the room and say no when it matters. That's the only weapon that ever worked. You watched it work today. And Lilindra Naramani, Magistrix of the Shi'ar Imperium, looked at the host of the Phoenix who had been offered a galaxy and asked instead to go home, and did a thing no Shi'ar ruler had done in the entire recorded history of the Empire. She thanked him plainly, without ceremony, the way one frightened person thanks another for showing them their fear had been a person all along. Then she pardoned Gladiator in front of the entire court for the treason of stillness, and named the moment a turning. And the narrator is pleased to report that the great Blue Praetor, who had wanted for 1,000 years to be wrong about the fire, spent the rest of his very long life telling anyone who would listen about the afternoon he finally was. The Shi'ar Imperium did not bow to Harry Potter all at once. Empires do not turn on a single afternoon, whatever the legends say, and the narrator has promised you honesty. But it began to turn there in that throne room, and the turning is worth recording. Lilindra, restored, dissolved the Annihilation Sanctions Authority with her first decree and ordered the new sun at the system's rim left burning as a monument, so that no Shi'ar would ever again look up without seeing a doomsday that had been taught to give warmth. With her second decree she ended the 1,000-year hunt. The Phoenix host, she proclaimed, was not to be pursued, not to be harvested, not to be condemned unheard, but observed in peace, with the patience the Empire had been too frightened to attempt in all its long history, and the old scholar in grey who had spoken for the truth wept again, because he had waited 90 years to hear it and had not expected to live so long. And then the court did bow, and the narrator wants to be precise about the bowing, because precision matters here more than anywhere. They did not bow because they had been conquered. They did not bow in worship, the way the fire's old cults had bowed, the way Deathbird's terror had wanted them to grovel. They bowed the way one bows to a thing that has shown you that your deepest certainty was wrong and your deepest fear was, all along, a person, the bow of 10,000 beings acknowledging that they had been afraid of the wrong thing for 1,000 years, and that the right thing, the thing they should have been seeking all that time, was standing in front of them in a scorched coat, having caught their doom and made it a sun. Gladiator knelt first and the guard knelt with him, and then the tiers came down one by one, the military caste and the scholars and the nobility, a galaxy's mighty lowering themselves before a man who had refused in their own throne room every grand and terrible thing his power offered him. Harry, for the record, found the whole thing acutely uncomfortable and said so, which only made the scholars love him more. But the bow that the title of this account promised you, the bow that matters, was not the Empire's. It happened later, quieter, and it was not a bow of subjects at all, and the narrator has been saving it. When the ceremonies were done and the Empire's gratitude had been survived, the four of them stood together at the rim of the new sun, in the dark at the edge of the system, looking at the warmth that had been a doom. And Jean Grey turned to Harry, and she did not kneel because she was not a subject and never would be, but she inclined her head the way one equal honors another, the way Storm had inclined hers on a Cornish cliff a lifetime ago, and she said, "I spent 10 years certain that the fire was the worst thing that ever happened to me. You made it into the thing that brought me you. I don't bow to your power, Harry. I've seen what bowing to that power costs. But I'll bow to the one who held it and chose us every single time when the whole universe told him to choose the flood. That man I'd follow anywhere." And Storm inclined her head beside her, regal and serene, a queen acknowledging not a king but a peer who had earned the rarest thing she had to give, which was her trust. And Emma Frost, who had never bowed to anyone in her life and had built her entire self around the refusal, looked at Harry Potter for a long moment, and then lowered her head fractionally, deliberately, the most expensive gesture in her repertoire, and said, "If you ever tell anyone I did that, I will rearrange your memories so thoroughly you'll think you were born in Surrey." Which was from Emma, a vow of devotion so total that Harry laughed until the new sun blurred. Three women who could each level a city, bowing not in submission, never in submission, but in the free and chosen homage of equals to the one person who had been handed the power to make them anything he wished and had instead relentlessly insisted they remain entirely themselves. That is the bow the legends would mangle. That is the bow the narrator has been bringing you to for 7 chapters. It looked to the watching Empire like a court honoring a god. It was, in truth, something far rarer and far harder to hold. 3 free people choosing a man, and a man refusing, with everything in him, to make the choosing anything less than free. They went home in the end the way they had come, by folding the distance, and the cliff in Cornwall was exactly as they had left it, which felt, after an empire and a doomsday, like the most extravagant luxury imaginable. The impossible flowers had not died. They turned their faces toward Harry as the 4 of them appeared on the wet grass in the gray English afternoon, a whole congregation of them tracking him, and he found this time that he did not mind being followed by flowers because he had made his peace with what he was. The wizarding world, which had spent a week deciding that Harry Potter had slain Voldemort in a pillar of celestial fire, never learned about the Shi'ar at all, and the narrator finds a great deal of comfort in this. There are powers in the universe so far above the squabbles of one small magical community on one small island that the community would not survive the knowledge of them. And Harry had decided, somewhere over the course of catching a moon, that the kindest thing he could do for the world that had made him was to let it keep its manageable legends and never tell it how close the sky had come to ending. Ron and Hermione came to the cliff the day after the Empire because that is what they had always done, arrived in the aftermath of Harry's disasters with food and questions and the particular loyalty of people who had stopped being impressed by him at roughly age 12 and loved him the better for it. Hermione looked at the new calm in him, the way the fire sat quiet behind his eyes, the easy, unforced manner of a man who had stopped being afraid of himself, and she did not ask what had happened, because some things are too large for the asking, and she had learned, over a long friendship, which questions to leave in their boxes. "You look well," she said instead, which from Hermione Granger was an entire interrogation. "I caught a moon," Harry said, "made it into a sun, talked an empress out of murdering 10,000 people, got bowed to by a galaxy which was mortifying, came home." He handed her a cup of tea made the ordinary way. "How was your week?" Ron set the kitchen on fire trying to make pancakes. "It was one pancake," Ron said with dignity. "And the kitchen is fine, mostly fine. Mum's still not speaking to me about the curtains." He looked at the 3 formidable women arranged with varying grace around Harry's cottage, at Emma critiquing the local wine and Storm coaxing the hearth and Jean burning toast with what Ron correctly identified as deliberate provocation, and he leaned toward Harry and said, in the tone of a man who has known another man since they were 11 and feels entitled to commentary, "So this is the situation now, is it? The 3 of them, and you." "This is the situation," Harry agreed. Ron considered this for a long moment, with the gravity of a man weighing a great mystery of the universe. "Mate," he said finally, "I have absolutely no notes. I'm a bit frightened of all of them, and I think that's correct. Hermione, we should go before the White One reads my mind and finds out about the curtains. But he gripped Harry's shoulder before he left, hard, the grip of a brother, and said low, glad you're all right. You scared us the last few weeks. You had a look, you don't have it anymore. And that, the narrator notes, was the truest assessment of the whole affair delivered by anyone in the account, because Ron Weasley had never in his life been clever about cosmic forces and had always been clever about Harry. Before the others had finished shaking the galaxy off their shoulders, Harry walked out alone into his own garden because there was a conversation he needed to have, and it was not one the women could have for him. He stood among the impossible flowers in the gray English light and addressed the fire directly as he had on the first night, as he intended to for the rest of his life. We did it, he said, not the unmaking, the other thing. You caught a doom and made it a sun, and you did it small, and you did it with people braced inside the choosing, and I want you to notice how it felt, because I need you to remember it the next time you tell me the flood would be easier. And the fire, banked deep in the marrow of him, did notice and did remember, and pressed against him not the old hunger and not the old grief, but something the narrator has been waiting 7 chapters to be able to report: contentment. The vast lonely engine that had eaten suns and wept galaxies and loved one woman into a catastrophe sat quiet in a man's chest in a garden on a cliff, and was, for the first time in its incomprehensible existence, content, because it had finally been taught the thing it had asked to be taught in a dream in the first week: how to love something without unmaking it. Neither of them had known how. They had learned it together, which was the only way it could ever have been learned, and the learning had cost an empire its certainty, and a man 2 brushes with becoming a god, and 3 women a walk into a burning mind, and it had been all of it worth the price. You are going to outlive them, the fire said to him then, gently, because it did not lie to him any more and would not start with the kindest lie of all. They are mortal, Harry, and you are becoming something that is not, and one day, far from now, you will stand in this garden and they will not, and the grief of it will be the largest thing you have ever held, larger than me, and on that day I will offer you the flood. I will offer to unmake the grief, or to unmake death itself, or to keep them by force the way I once kept the woman at the rail of the ship. I am telling you this now while you are happy, so that the happy version of you can warn the grieving one. You will have to say number even then. Especially then. I know, Harry said into the gray morning, and found that he did know, and that the knowing did not spoil the morning but somehow sharpened it, the way the awareness of an ending sharpens every good thing inside it. I'll say number, and I won't say it alone, because by then there'll be others, the ones we teach, the ones who learn to be lines of their own, and one of them will stand in this garden with me on that day and say my name. That's the whole of it, isn't it? Nobody holds the fire alone, not even at the end, especially not at the end. And the fire, which had spent 1 billion years cert that it was destined to be alone with its hunger forever, sat in the chest of a man who had promised it company even unto grief, and did the thing that the narrator will call, for lack of any better word in the human vocabulary it has so fondly abused, a sigh, and was quiet, and was, against all the long odds of its terrible existence, at peace. Harry stood a moment longer among the flowers that turned to follow him, and then he went back inside to the women and the kettle and the ordinary evening, and let the cosmic thing keep its peace, and kept his own. Charles Xavier reached them that evening, his presence settling into the cottage from across an ocean, and the relief in him was a thing they all felt, warm and enormous and unspoken. You did it, he said, the thing I believed in and could not promise. You changed a mind 1,000 years certain, and you did it without burning, and you came home yourselves. He paused, and the old telepath who had spent his life loving difficult and dangerous and frightened people into their strength allowed himself a moment of something that was almost pride and almost grief, because the two are closer than anyone admits. Do you know what you have done, Harry? You have given the universe a thing it has never had, a phoenix it does not need to fear. Not because the fire is gone, it will never be gone, you will carry it all your life, but because you have shown that it can be held by someone who chooses every day the drop instead of the flood. The galaxy is going to be different now. Not safe, never safe, but different. He withdrew gently, leaving his regard behind like a hand on a shoulder. Rest, you have earned an evening, and Harry, there will be more. There is always more. The power you carry will draw threats the way a flame draws moths for the rest of your life, but not tonight. Tonight, be a man in a cottage with the people he loves. You have spent your whole life being needed by everyone. Spend one evening being wanted by 3. And he was gone, and the cottage was quiet, and the 4 of them stood in it in the gray gold light of an ordinary evening, with a god bank small in one man's marrow and a kettle that needed filling. He's right, you know, Emma said, shrugging out of her coat, white silk still somehow immaculate after a doomsday, because some things are simply true about Emma Frost. There will be more. There's always more. Cosmic horrors, ambitious empires, the occasional resurrected Dark Lord, presumably some appalling thing from a dimension none of us has had the misfortune to visit yet. We will spend the rest of our lives being the line the fire cannot cross. She said it lightly, but she was watching him as she watched everything, reading the shape of what he truly felt underneath what he showed. I find I don't mind, I who have minded everything. I blame you entirely. I intend to keep blaming you for a very long time. How long? Harry asked. Don't be greedy, Emma said. It's unbecoming in a god. But she crossed to him as she said it, and the sharpness in her had gone soft at the edges, and the fire in Harry strained toward her with its ancient eagerness. And he held it gently, choosing its size, giving her not the flood of certainty she had organized her whole life around refusing, but the small, true human thing she had crossed a galaxy undefended to find. A man choosing her with his own heart, and leaving her free to choose back. Storm built them a fire in the hearth, the ordinary kind with wood, because she said a house that had survived an empire deserved a flame it did not have to be afraid of. And the four of them sat around it as the evening came down, and Jean burned the toast, and Emma critiqued it, and Harry made tea the ordinary way, and Storm watched the small domestic comedy of it with the serene fondness of a woman who had ruled and stolen and walked away from ruling and found, at the rim of her long storied life, that this was the thing worth having all along. Later, when the fire in the hearth had burned down to embers and the toast had been eaten and the wine had been, by Emma's grudging verdict, upgraded from an insult to disappointment, they talked, the four of them in the low gold dark, about what came next, because powerful people cannot help planning and because the planning was in its way a kind of intimacy. It can't stay the four of us in a cottage forever, Jean said, not sadly, simply truly. Charles is right, the power draws threats. And there are other hosts the fire might find someday, other people about to be handed a fire they don't understand. We learned something here that nobody in the universe knew before tonight. That feels like a thing we're not allowed to keep to ourselves. A school, Storm said, and there was the ghost of an old idea in it, an idea she had spent a lifetime inside. Not Charles's, something smaller, a place for the ones who are handed fires too large to hold alone. We would not teach them to refuse the fire. We would teach them what you learned, Harry, to be small enough to hold it, to never go into it alone. You're describing, Emma said, a finishing school for gods. I find I'm appalled to discover I want to run it. The standards would be ferocious. The uniforms would be magnificent. But she was not entirely joking, and they all heard that she was not, and Harry felt the shape of a future settle quietly into the room. A future that was not a cottage and not a throne, but something in between. A life of being the line the fire could not cross and teaching others to be lines of their own. Rule 6, Harry said. Whatever this becomes, we build it so that everyone in it has someone who will tell them no solitary hosts. No lonely gods. That's the whole curriculum. Everything else is details. He looked at the three of them in the firelight, the goddess and the queen and the white queen, the three women who had crossed a galaxy and walked undefended into his burning mind and bowed to him not as subjects but as equals choosing an equal. And the fire in him strained as it would strain for the rest of his life, toward the grand gesture, toward making this moment permanent and safe and certain, toward keeping them, and he held the drop instead, and chose, with his own scarred human heart, simply to be present for a thing he could lose, which is the only way anything is ever truly kept. And the narrator, who has grown fond of them across 7 chapters, will draw the curtain on the rest of the evening with the discretion such evenings deserve, and tell you only what matters. That 3 women who had each been alone in their power for a very long time, and 1 man who had been alone in his for longer, chose one another freely with their own minds and their own scarred hearts, and that the fire for once was content to be a guest at the warmth, banked and quiet and allowed to witness a thing it had spent a billion years too hungry to learn, that the keeping of something precious has never once required the unmaking of it. And that a God who learns to be small enough to hold what he loves is the only kind of God worth a damn. The narrator has one last thing to say, and then he will let them be. You came to this account perhaps for the spectacle of it. The power, the harem, the cosmic fire, the bird empire brought low. And the narrator has given you all of that because he promised it and because, frankly, it was enjoyable to write, and there is no shame in a story that delights in its own largeness. But the thing underneath the spectacle, the thing the whole Baroque cosmic apparatus was built to carry, is much smaller, and the narrator hopes you will carry it out of the account the way Harry carried the fire out of every confrontation, held and chosen and never quite spent. It is this. Everyone in their own way is handed a fire. It is rarely the size of a galaxy. It is usually the size of a temper or a talent or a love or a grief or whatever private power a person carries that could, unwatched, become a flood. And everyone is offered daily by a voice that sounds exactly like their own, the gorgeous reasonable logic of the grand gesture, the certainty that they have earned the right to be as large as their power allows. And the whole of a life, the narrator has come to believe, is the long quiet work of choosing the drop instead of the flood, of staying small enough to hold the things you love without unmaking them, of doubting yourself in the precise moment that doubt feels most like cowardice, and of letting the people who love you stand inside your certainty to hold it steady when you cannot hold it alone. Harry Potter was handed the largest fire in creation, and he held it, and the holding made him not a god but something the narrator finds far more interesting, which is a person who could have been a god and chose, every single day with 3 remarkable women beside him and a kettle on the stove, to be a man instead. The flowers still turn to follow him. The fire still offers him the flood. And every morning, on a cliff over a gray and tireless sea, he says no and fills the kettle, and that, dear reader, in the end, is the whole of the wager, and the whole of the victory, and the whole of the story. Chapter 7 End.